sealed, so they may be older. The preservation effects of embalming are only temporary, so we may get some choice surprises as we open our boxes. And I have to tell you that just before we began our conversation, Matthew discovered 2 recent ones. One has only been dead for a day or 2. That could be that poor girl's brother, Anson Taylor. Do you want to see them? They're both male, and one is quite gorgeous. Nikki grimaced. Rory! But yes, I'd better, I suppose. Rory led her over to the centre of the facing wall. I'm afraid you'll have to stand on this. He placed a kick-step in front of the coffin, and Nikki stepped onto it. Oh, my! You would never know he was dead, his colour, and the condition of his hair. You're right, he looks beautiful. Nikki had been expecting a pallid corpse, but as she looked at the raven-haired young man, she felt the urge to touch his smooth skin to check for warmth. I told you he was gorgeous. Our man is an expert, Inspector. I don't think it will be hard for you to track him down. Not many people possess such skill. A professional? Well, I know for a fact that Greenborough Adult Education doesn't offer evening classes in embalming for beginners, and it's not something that is wildly popular as a hobby. He gave her an angelic smile. So, is it your missing Mr. Taylor? No, it's not him. But you said there was another one. 1 bunk higher, I'm afraid. I'll get a stepladder. Nikki waited and wondered if she would recognise Anson Taylor. Here we are. Up you go. Rory held the ladder, and she began to climb past the immaculate body of the handsome mystery man. From Steph's description and my vague recollection, I'd say that's him. Nikki looked at the dead man's arm. And yes, he has a home ink tattoo. It's Anson, I've no doubt. Although as his sister is outside, I suppose she could verify it. As she has already been in here, I don't think another visit is appropriate. My assistants and I will bring the coffin down, put him on a trolley, and take him out to her. Once we've checked this spot for evidence, and since we have a chance to positively identify him, he can go directly back to the mortuary for a post-mortem. Then she can visit him in the chapel of rest. Thanks, Rory. That's very thoughtful of you. No trouble, Inspector. Now forgive me, but I must get on. Nikki went back out onto the shadowy fen and pulled out her mobile. It was time to explain as much as she could to Joseph, and this time she would not say no when he offered to cancel his leave. Later that evening, Stephanie Taylor identified her brother and finally agreed to be taken home. She declined to break the news to their father and let the police do it. Her father had been the cause of all the heartbreak in her and Anson's life. He was a drinker, an abuser, and a bully. If she hadn't found the courage to blow the whistle on him, she had no doubt at all that she and her brother would have died years ago. She hoped the bastard would not come to the funeral, but if he did, at least it would be the last time she'd ever have to see him. That night, as Fabian and his new go-between disposed of Monk's carefully wrapped and weighted body, Carver set about shredding and burning every paper, document and file that Carl Shine had given him on his blasted airfield project. By midnight, one man's dream, the fantastic property development and renovation scheme that was RAF Flaxton Mere, had ceased to exist. But sadly, with the disappearance and probable demise of Freddie's top man Michael Finn, so had the biggest job that Carver had ever planned. It had been a once-in-a-lifetime scam, carefully crafted onto a tight timeline around a major London event, and Michael had been the key player. He had no understudy, no one of equal expertise was waiting in the wings, ready to run on at a moment's notice. And there was no time to find one. Freddie's life-changing, money-spinning scheme was dead in the water, a bit like Monk, the DIY killer who had erroneously believed that he could double-cross him by taking his own generous cut and the fat wad of money that should have been Fabian's. As the last document reduced to ashes, Freddie decided that he had never hated anyone as much as he hated Carl Shine. Even knowing that he was now lying on a mortuary slab gave him little satisfaction. He had tried to do the boy a favour for old time's sake, and in return, Shine had managed to sabotage Carver's whole world. He sighed and closed the heavy doors of the wood-burning stove. On careful examination of his present position, Freddie had decided that he had little option but to close up business and take a very long holiday, preferably somewhere hot. Chapter 17. Overnight, Greenborough Police Station had transformed from a moderately quiet market town cop shop into the hub of the universe. Officers from surrounding divisions poured in, and although the place heaved with men and women, there was an odd feeling of quiet disbelief and shock hanging over the rooms and corridors. Superintendent Greg Woodhull called an early morning meeting.
First, I'd like to thank the teams from Nottingham and Humberside for joining us, and we also have the assistance of the force psychologist Richard Foley.
He nodded towards a smart, fair-haired man who leant casually against the back wall.
He will remain on site for the duration of this major inquiry.
Greg stood with his hands behind his back and rocked back and forth.
I cannot emphasize strongly enough how important it is that we find the person who has killed so many victims. Whatever you are working on, if it can be put on hold, do so. I want every available officer working this case. Now, I'll pass you over to D.I. Galena, and she'll bring you up to speed on what was found at Flaxton Mere.
Nikki spoke for around 10 minutes. She felt that her words were ill-chosen and inadequate. How could she briefly describe what she had seen? The results of a lifetime devoted to murder? The things in the crypt that had been the stuff of Edgar Allan Poe and were quite beyond a simple detective with the Fenland constabulary.
So, we will need to question everyone who has any connection to or knowledge of Flaxton Mere. That will include the owners and the employees of the industrial units in the hangars, the History Society members, and anyone who had dealings with Carl Shine. We've been told there were surveyors on the airfield a few days ago, but we have no idea where they came from or what company they work for.
She ended by saying that the forensic evidence would be vital, and that, while every effort was being made to speed things up, the investigation was on such a massive scale that it would take time. Before she drew the meeting to a close, Nikki added, "This monster has been living among us. He or she will most likely be someone we have come across, maybe even had a drink with or met through work. And if we hadn't made this terrible discovery, the killer would have gone on killing, right under our noses. We cannot let him get away. Let's get to work. Let's find him before he murders anyone else." Yvonne replaced the phone and walked quickly to the boss's office. "Pike's awake and wants to talk to someone. As I saw him before, would you mind if I went, ma'am?" Nikki looked about as grey and drawn as Yvonne had ever seen her. "He's not high on my list of priorities, but as his gran is still missing, I suppose we must. Yes, off you go." When she arrived at the room into which Pike had been moved, Yvonne found the ferret-like creature trying to eat a bowl of something resembling wallpaper paste. His skinny form barely made a shape under the covers. Pike was fully conscious, and now he was hidden in the quiet room just off the main ward, he seemed considerably less flaky. "Ready to talk about your adventure, Mr. Pike?" She kept her voice friendly. After trying to look at her balefully, he suddenly gave up, leant back into his pillows and began to explain how he came to fall down the shaft. "I ain't no smackhead, so you can forget telling me I was high, but I swear to God that I heard a plane coming down. Heard the engines cutting out, and I heard it hit the ground. No shit, officer, I heard it crash. Then I saw flames and heard this horrible screaming. I wanted to help, but then it all got too much for me and I ran and went straight down that bloody hole." Yvonne looked at him carefully. She'd had enough experience with liars over the years, and she could tell that whatever he was describing had actually happened in some way. "But there has certainly been no report of an air crash, civil or military. Have you ever heard anything like it before? You'd been out there plenty of times, hadn't you?" "Never. It was really horrible." He spooned in another mouthful of milk pudding and glared at the bowl suspiciously. "Do you think this is porridge?" "I'd say it looks more like Artex. But back to the mere. It's a spooky spot, isn't it? That's why I chose it to hide my stuff." He tried to ease his shattered leg and winced with pain. "I'd been skimming drugs from Anson Taylor for months and stashing them in one of the old buildings on the airfield." "And Anson found out?" Pike shrugged. "Not that I know of. I haven't seen Anson for days." He bit his lip and stared at Yvonne. "Me old gran's really dead, you know. They say I imagined it, but I didn't. She was brought into that place I was in before I came here." "What, Artie, you?" "Yes, that's it. But she died. And I killed her." "No, William, you didn't. You couldn't have lifted a finger to hurt her. You had more wires coming out of you than a National Grid pylon. And the nurse told me her name was—" Yvonne struggled to remember. "Something else, but not like Pike." I don't care what you say, Constable Smart-Ass. I saw her wheel past me. The doctors thought I was out of it, but I could hear them. And I saw me gran. You thought you saw her? But okay, say it was her. How did you manage to kill her? You were a mess of drip strains, monitors, and... She pointed to his injured leg. Oh, yes, and don't forget the half-ton of scaffolding wrapped round your leg. Pike was silent. Come on, you're going to be here for a very long time. Why not just talk to me? Yvonne smiled as the youth eyed her up surreptitiously. He sighed and hung his head. I gamble. I owed money to some seriously bad men. A dealer was going to buy the stash of drugs that I stole from Anson, then I was going to settle the debt and bugger off. But I missed the meeting. And they'd threatened you with what? They said they'd kill Gran. Well, I know she's missing, but that old lady on the next trolley died of a heart condition, plain and simple. And after what you've just told me, we really need to find your Gran, so how about you stop telling me she was here and help us find her? Pike stuck out his chin and closed his eyes. I know what I know. Yvonne changed tack. So tell me about Flaxton Mere. Pike muttered. Well, there are often odd lights out on the marsh. What sort of lights? A deep voice came from the doorway. Come on, Pike, spit it out. What sort of bloody lights? Yvonne looked up to see the troubled face of PC Bob Tinker, and he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Dunno, really. Lots of the fen dwellers have seen them. My gran says it's a hobby lantern leading lost travellers to their watery graves. Yeah, right. And anything else? Bob sounded wary. A friend of Gran said she heard strange noises out there once. She was collecting samphire and she heard whispering and laughing. She might have been on the parsnip wine, but I dunno. He shrugged. It's a weird place. Scary. Yvonne frowned. Bob, what's rattling you? We've all heard about the lights. Anyone who's ever taken a call from old Miss Quinny knows about them. Reg and I heard noises. A sort of creepy laughter, and we saw moving lights when we were on duty up on the sea bank the other night. Perhaps we should have reported it, but... His voice faded into silence. But you were afraid of being called a big girl's blouse? Yvonne knew all about male coppers' egos. Something like that. He looked at Yvonne. But I think I'll mention it now. Pike had given up on the porridge and was staring at Yvonne. So what did they say the old woman's name was? Yvonne thought hard. Howit? Howlett. No, Hewitt. That's it. Hetty Hewitt. Pike went even paler. He stared straight ahead. You wouldn't listen, would you? I friggin' told you she was dead. My gran's maiden name is Hewitt. Hester Hewitt. An hour later, Nikki joined Yvonne and Bob at the hospital. We've arranged for a DNA test from the late Mrs. Hewitt, Mr. Pike. If it's a match with samples we've taken from your grandmother's home, then we'll know for certain. Now, can you give me the names of your grandmother's closest female friends? If she really is Mrs. Pike, then we need to know what happened, who brought her here, and where her animals are. A very subdued Pike gave them 3 names, then said, I'll try Miss Quinny first. He looked at Yvonne. She's the one you mentioned earlier, the old girl who complains about the lights. She went to school with Gran. Always called her Hetty. He looked miserably at her. D'you promise me that Gran wasn't hurt? Yvonne could tell that Pike's concern was genuine. She said, RTU said it was a massive coronary, and examination showed scarring on her heart, maybe from rheumatic fever as a child. But whatever, William, no one helped her on her way, I promise you. Okay? Thanks. Listen, if I help you, would it make things better for me when I finally get out of here? I mean, I know you'll be nicking me for dealing. The voice had lost its former aggression. But I spent a lot of time hanging around with Anson when he was making deals, so I can tell you a lot about drug suppliers and maybe other things too. We'll talk when you're stronger, and naturally, if you are sisters, there will be a certain amount that we can do to make things easier for you. Nikki turned to go, then said, We'll let you know about your grandmother. No need. Pike looked like a little lost kid. I know what I saw. Outside, Bob told Nikki about the things he and his crewmate had heard while on watch on the fen. Now I'm beginning to wonder if there isn't more to all this than just the superstitious crap. Me too. Nikki puffed out her cheeks. But I have to get back to the station. Perhaps one of you would go check out Mrs. Quinny. We need to tie this mess up before we can concentrate fully on the serial killer. I'll do it, said Yvonne. I'll pick up Niall and we'll go directly. A vast expanse of fields stretched out on either side of the long fen drove. Apart from a tiny dot that Yvonne knew to be a tractor way up ahead, the police car was the only vehicle for miles. "I wouldn't like to say how many times I've got lumbered with Miss Quinny." She grinned as she accelerated past the tractor. "Last time I saw her, she told me that the local RSPB group were actually a foreign spy ring. If it isn't alien spacecraft over the Marsh, it's sightings of Johnny Foreigner landing on the beaches. I'm never too sure if she's barking or just lonely."
"What if she isn't so daft after all?" murmured Niall thoughtfully. "Okay, the bit about E.T. and the Men in Black is rubbish, but too many people, including 2 police officers, have seen lights, so maybe there is something in it."
"I agree, but what?"
They drove the last few miles in silence. Miss Quinny came to the door wearing a threadbare knitted cardigan, faded corduroys, and a bobble hat, and declared that she was far too busy to talk to them. Yvonne and Niall immediately saw why, as behind her in the sitting room, sprawled out on her settee, were 2 elderly lurchers, a moth-eaten spaniel, a ragged-looking German shepherd, and an even more decrepit Jack Russell. One of several cats wound itself around their ankles, and the strange case of the missing animals was solved.
"You picked the animals up after you took your friend Hetty Hewitt, or Hester Pike as we know her, to the hospital, didn't you, Miss Quinny?" "Well, I could hardly leave them to fend for themselves, could I?" "So tell us what happened. And why did you give her name as Hewitt?" "I've known Hetty since I was 3. She'll always be Hetty Hewitt to me, and I don't know what happened."
Her arms were firmly crossed in front of her twig-like frame.
"She came knocking on my door, saying she'd had a funny turn. She doesn't have a car, so I gave her a cup of tea, and then we went off to see the doctor in Casterfen village. Halfway there she started gasping, said she had terrible pains in her chest, so I drove her to Greenborough Hospital. What else could I have done?"
"Miss Quinny, I'm not criticising you. We're just wondering why you left her there and never went back to see her."
"I had to get the animals, didn't I? And one of her old cats led me a right song and dance, nearly wrecked the place trying to catch it. Look!"
She proffered a scrawny arm for Yvonne's inspection. 3 wounds, now scabbing over, ran from her elbow to her wrist.
"Bleeding like a stuck pig I was. Still, I knew Hetty were right poorly, so I couldn't leave them, and I'd never go near the marsh after dark."
The voice was fast becoming a wail.
"And now I can't leave them at all, can I?"
Yvonne smiled at her gently.
"Miss Quinny, can we come in? We'd like to talk to you about your friend, and if you're up to it, we really will listen to you this time." She paused. "It's about the lights."
As Niall drove off the fen, Yvonne leafed through a dog-eared old exercise book.
"Well, for such a funny old bird, this is the most concise record of the comings and goings on the marsh that you could wish to see. She could show you a thing or two about taking notes, lad. Listen to this. 8:30 Friday 14. Lights commenced. Moved in an easterly direction, flicked for 10 minutes, then faded. Recommenced at 9:45 p.m. and repeated above pattern."
Yvonne stabbed her finger on the page.
"Now that is interesting, because Reg and Bob saw lights at around that time, and it was a Friday. What do you make of that?"
"Well, if we're talking about something really simple, I'd say a time switch." Niall turned and grinned at her. "They turn lights on and off at allotted times, don't they?"
"I think maybe we should take a look down on that marsh, don't you?"
Chapter 18. Joseph hurried along the corridor to the interview rooms, then halted abruptly as his phone rang. He glanced at it and saw a number he didn't recognize. He flipped it open and heard a voice say, "I got your message, Sergeant Easter. Sorry I missed you. My name is Tug Owen." Joseph ducked into an empty room and closed the door. "Thank you for returning the call, Mr. Owen." Joseph desperately tried to think of what to say to the man. "It's about Frank Reed, I assume," Owen prompted. "I've been expecting this, although I thought it would be Nikki Galena ringing. I didn't fool her, did I?" "No, sir, but it takes a lot to fool the inspector." Joseph felt relief at the way the conversation was going. "What do you already know, Sergeant?" "I know about Eve Anderson." Then he added with a slight shiver, "and about Flaxton Mere." "I very much doubt that you do." There was a soft, humourless laugh. "You know that Eve exists. You know she is somehow connected to Frank. And you've seen the name RAF Flaxton Mere on documents, but apart from that, Sergeant, you know nothing." Joseph swore to himself. The easy conversation had taken a distinct downward turn. "So what can you tell me, sir?" There was the sound of a sigh. "Whatever I tell you will cause Nikki a great deal of pain. Do you really want to know? Sorry, but painful or not, I think you know the answer to that. Then first understand that Frank Reed loved Kathy. He would never have left her, but he and Eve... The man hesitated. Years before. They went through a terrible ordeal together, and they formed a special sort of bond. What kind of bond? Do I have to spell it out? He sighed, then said, it was complicated. Joseph remembered saying those very words to Tamsin, and wondered if all breakups and breakdowns came under that heading when you scratched beneath the surface. Frank was in pieces, Sergeant. He admitted to me that Eve meant the world to him, but she was a career RAF officer, and at the time she would not give up her career to settle down. Because of that, Frank moved on, and he met Kathy. How long ago was this? Eons. He was a young man, and despite still caring deeply for Eve, he fell desperately in love with Kathy. Tug made a little huffing sound. The incident that happened, when he and Eve were thrown together under horrific conditions, left a permanent imprint on both of them, and neither could truly let the other go. Frank became living proof that you can love two people. What happened? What was the incident? I'm sorry, it was classified. Still is, but suffice to say, there was an accident aboard an aircraft carrier, and they were trapped for days. Joseph knew from experience the kind of bonds that formed with your military brothers, and he knew firsthand what trauma could do. He decided to move on. But they met again years later, at Flaxton Mere Airfield. They tried to work together, but the past got in the way. It was a disaster. What was happening at Flaxton Mere, sir? Why the interest in that old place? All I can tell you is that Frank was asked to take a team out there and do a detailed report for the MOD, post-decommissioning prior to selling off the land. He was to work in conjunction with the government department, and when he made contact, he found that his opposite number was none other than Eve Anderson. Joseph did a few calculations in his head, but surely his wife, Kathy, was dead by then. She was, but Frank was an honourable man, and he possessed a conscience. Plus he loved Nikki to distraction. It tore him to shreds. You said working together was a disaster. It was. As the years passed, Eve had discovered that she had made a terrible mistake. Without Frank, she was lost. She never married, even though she knew Frank had a new life with Kathy. But then, when they met again at Flaxton Mere, and she realised that he was finally free, or so she believed, he wouldn't be with her. Tug Owen made a little tutting sound. Frank tried to explain, but in the end she walked off, and he never saw her again. Much later he realised that Nikki would probably have understood, or at least accepted the situation, and Kathy would never have wanted him to live alone. He had thrown away his last chance of happiness. Did he go after her? There was a long silence. Then Tug Owen said, Yes, he did. But he never found her. That, I believe, is why he wanted Nikki to look for her. Something happened years ago. Something Frank should have told Nikki about. But he never did. He said it was never the right time. But if he was as orderly as Nikki says, why didn't he write it in a letter for her to read after he'd died? He told me it was something that had to be spoken about face to face. He wasn't a hard man, and he didn't want Nikki hurt by an impersonal note. Tug sighed. I guess his mind gave out before he got around to it. And do you know what it is? Joseph asked. Sorry, no. Although I do have a suspicion. Joseph glanced at his watch. He had interviews piling up, and he'd promised to meet Tamsin, but there were still things he needed to know. Mr. Owen, did Frank ever tell you about his first wife? He did, of course he did. After all, we were close friends. She died in a tragic accident, I believe, when Nikki was a baby. The line went quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, but try as I might, I can't recall her name. No matter. He thanked the man for his help, and promised to ring him before the funeral to let him know how much of the information, if any, he'd passed on to Nikki. As he left the room, he wished with all his heart that they had never agreed to look for Eve. No matter what they discovered now, it was going to wreck Nikki's image of her father forever. Yvonne and Niall drove back out to the marsh, but not to the crime scene. They were more interested in the sea-bank path that led across the edge of the marsh. The tide was still going out, which gave them plenty of time to get out to where Bob and Reg said they had seen the lights. Have you been out here before, Vonnie? She nodded. I came here when I was young, and I know it's the tide that we have to be wary of, not the mud. We won't get sucked under, just keep to the firmer ground, okay? Carefully they picked their way across the boggy, wet ground, slipping on the damp grass hillocks and cursing at the shallow, greasy-looking water pools that turned out to be deeper than they looked. "This godforsaken place goes on for miles. We'll never find anything out here. We need half the station with us." Niall stared sadly at his mud-caked boots. "Well, I think we both know that isn't going to happen, my cherub, so quit moaning and keep looking." They stood together, staring around the lonely marsh, and wondered what they were doing there, with wet socks and mud-splattered uniforms. Yvonne looked at her wristwatch. "We've got another 15 minutes before we have to start back. There's a breeze getting up, which usually means that the tide's on the turn. Killer or no killer, we're not getting caught out here." "Agreed." Niall kicked at the lush green leaves of some kind of marsh plant. "I'm not sure what I thought we'd find anyway." "Something like this, maybe." Niall moved across to where his crewmate half knelt in a patch of coarse marsh grass, then let out a long whistle. Attached to a wooden stake that had been driven deep into the soft soil was what looked at first glance to be a lamp of some kind. Closer examination showed it to be 3 triangular mirrors forming a prism, a reflector. "Here's another one." Niall moved several meters away, "but this has foil strips hanging from it." They found 6 reflectors in total. "So, all we need now is to find where the original light source comes from, and when night falls, we'll try to find it for ourselves." Niall looked back towards the sea bank and just beyond to the old ruined building that had once been the watchtower for RAF Flaxton Mere. "Job done, my friend. Now let's get off this bloody bog." Nikki took one look at Rory Wilkinson and hoped that she looked better than he did. For all his jokes and black humour, the enormity of this discovery had even got to him. He had been in the crypt all night and was now heading into his second day without sleep. He seemed to have taken on the role of guardian of the Flaxton Mere necropolis. "Rory, I have to point out that a practically comatose forensic scientist is not a lot of use, plus the lack of sleep is doing absolutely nothing for your dashing good looks. Yes, I'm desperately glad that this place doesn't have mirrors. The shock of seeing my ravaged physiognomy could bring me out in hives. So, you'll take a break. We do have a rota in place." "I'd love to, but there is only one of me, and whereas I would normally savour that unique position until Dr. Bass gets here from Cambridge, this is it." He pointed to a folding camp bed and a sleeping bag, pushed into a small niche next to the burial chamber. "And no comments regarding the camp bit, if you don't mind. Half of Greenborough got there before you." "You're staying down here? For heaven's sake, man, you can't sleep here." "You are so right. Socos are so noisy. Chatter like magpies, can't get a wink." "Rory, please. You are not staying here. I know you feel a responsibility to get these poor souls identified, but not at the expense of your health, and possibly your sanity." Nikki was emphatic. The thought of having to spend 1 minute longer than necessary in this chamber of horrors made her shudder. "Sorry, Inspector, but it's only until my colleague arrives. He's an expert in archaeological forensics, and I think he is going to find a few very unusual surprises at this little dig." "Like what?" The pathologist ran a slender hand through his floppy fringe and pushed it unsuccessfully away from his forehead. "I've just opened one of the older boxes, and I thought it strange that I wasn't overpowered by the stench. I found a body that had been, well, almost mummified. The air quality down here is exceptional, but the fact that the body didn't stink was because the internal organs had been removed. The body cavities had then been packed with herbs, spices, and some sort of linen material soaked in oils, including cedarwood, if I'm not mistaken. It's bizarre, the trouble this man has gone to." He raised his hands in amazement. "Why?" "Now, there is a question. And I can't answer it, Inspector, but I can tell you one thing. This killer, and I am only assuming that he does his killing himself, spends an inordinate amount of time cleaning and preparing his victims' bodies." "In preparation for something sexual? I mean, is he a fastidious necrophiliac?" "Absolutely not. Not one of them, man or woman, has been assaulted or abused in any way by their friendly mortician. Frankly, guessing that a lot of these persons were tramps or runaways, they are probably more hygienic now than they've ever been, which is a refreshing thought. But I digress. You remember the dark-haired, blue-eyed male that I showed you?" "His eyes were closed, but I assume you mean the gorgeous one." "Exactly. He was the last to die. Well, he has been expertly embalmed, using up-to-date chemicals.
Glutaraldehyde, I suspect, as the skin tone is very natural. But not only that, his hair had been washed and trimmed, and the skin had been treated with some kind of sweet-smelling moisturizing cream. He indicated a large plastic toolbox. That there is full of cosmetics, makeup, oil, shampoos, soaps, you name it. Anyway, as we've progressed through opening the boxes, we can see how his methods have improved over the years. It seems that he keeps them on view until they start to lose their looks. Then he seals them up. As I said, he took care of these people. Your psychologist should have a field day with this lot. I'll pass it on. Now I have to get back and report all this to the super, but before I go, any clue about the coffins themselves? I mean, they're all identical, aren't they? Yes, mass-produced, and they are certainly old. I'm making no guesses about them, but I think my friend Doc Bass will be able to help you with that little conundrum. Hopefully he will be here by tomorrow morning. Nikki climbed up the stone steps, glancing back at the scene below her, where ghostly hooded and white-suited figures moved purposefully backwards and forwards. Although she had been in the force for many years and had dealt with more than her fair share of murders, even she was finding the sheer scale of this crime hard to get her head around. Above ground, it was an enormous relief to see the massive uniformed presence. The airfield was virtually sealed off, although at the main gates and all around the perimeter fencing, the media gathered, baying for news about the gruesome discovery. Today they would make a statement, but it would be short on detail. For once, the actual truth was more chilling than the rumours. She smiled bitterly as she drove through the sea of faces and cameras. This was just the beginning. She had thought they had problems with one dead property owner, a missing drug dealer, a disappearing old lady, and a handful of animals. No way could their proposed statement mention the finding of some 19 bodies. It would make Greenborough the mecca for every poor soul who had ever made an inquiry to the police or the Missing Persons Bureau. They would be inundated with calls, and the town would be flooded with grieving partners and relatives, all desperate for closure. As she pulled out into the main road, she cursed under her breath. The assignment was tough enough, but before long the curious would start drifting into town, and not only would that hamper their inquiries, they would have the added concern of trying to protect them. Like it or not, Greenborough had a serial killer on the loose, a man who had been prevented from returning to his refuge, which would make him dangerous beyond all imagining. How the hell could they be expected to protect a town full of visitors from a psychotic murderer? She moved the gear lever up into fifth, and decided that it was a problem for those higher up in the ranks to ponder over. Nikki had the killer to catch. Professor Wilkinson, can we close this one, please? We've taken our samples and the photographer is finished with her. Rory nodded to the technician. As soon as their preliminary tests had been done, the bodies were being numbered and the lids temporarily sealed to await full post-mortem. The first victims had been easier to process, in spite of each coffin being scrutinized minutely for evidence of the person who had put them there in the first place, but the older ones were taking considerably more time. The pathologist grimly wished that Stuart Bass would get here. He could do with some expert help right now. And Stuart was an expert, all right. It was just unfortunate that he had a prior commitment that he needed a few days to extricate himself from, the small matter of his honeymoon. Rory yawned again and decided that he was not entirely sure how long he was going to be able to keep up the pace. The sound of a hammer sealing up a coffin brought him back to reality. Matthew, are we fully staffed for cataloguing these poor souls? We will be by this afternoon, sir. Your request for assistance has been granted. Good, good. Right, better press on then. It helps having the tower in situ, doesn't it? He looked at their latest acquisition, a painter and decorator's scaffolding tower that allowed easier and safer access to the stone shelves in their deceased residence. You're not kidding, Prof. Oh, by the way, the police sergeant wants to know if they can start the search for the other entrance. They've had no luck from outside. Rory nodded. He took off his glasses and wiped the lens absent-mindedly on the sleeve of his white suit. It's an amazing structure, Matthew. What was it, Prof? I mean, was it an underground church? Undoubtedly it was religious in nature. One of the historians told the DI that this was once the site of a monastery and some other religious edifice before that. I expect you have visited many grand churches that have magnificent crypts beneath their chancels, full of shrines and tombs and saints' relics. He sat back on a stone ledge. I could be wrong, but I think that the smaller chamber was an undercroft. They were often found beneath a monastery, mainly used for storage and administration purposes.
And this big chamber with the coffins.
That's where my theories get fuzzy, Matthew. This place is full of contradictions. It is clearly a burial vault. I mean, it's holding exactly what it was meant to hold, dead bodies and coffins. But why so many?
Matthew shrugged. Pass. Rory patted his younger helper on the shoulder.
Go tell the sergeant that he can send in the cavalry. The only place I don't want them is the burial vault, because of the bodies.
As Matthew went off to give the uniformed officer the go-ahead for the search for the other entrance, Rory returned to his work. He gazed across the sea of wooden boxes with their silent occupants. It was going to be a very long day. "Excuse me, sir, may I take a short break?" It was one of the on-loan Sokos.
Had enough already?
"No, sir, not at all. Just need a
toilet break might be the expression that you're looking for."
"Exactly."
"Well, hurry back. We have an awful lot of guests here that we need to take care of, and I'm sure they will miss you if you are gone too long, Mr.
Rory tried to read the official identity pass around the man's neck. "Sean Fowler, sir. I'm on loan from Nottingham." He gave the pathologist an odd look. "You talk like the victims are still alive."
"Until we can provide them with legal death certificates, they are not technically dead, Sean Fowler from Nottingham. Well, the older ones may have been declared as such, but until I can give them a name and recognize their passing properly, I prefer to think of them in a sort of cryogenic state, just waiting, if you know what I mean."
Again the odd look, and Rory realized that yet another underling had decided his temporary boss was as mad as a box of frogs. "You'll be telling me you like this place next." Rory considered his reply carefully.
"I have attended sites of intense pain and suffering, with bodies devastated and torn asunder. I have seen too many victims of someone else's rage and evil desires, and compared to those scenes, Mr. Fowler, this is indeed a peaceful place."
"It contains 19 murder victims, and heaven knows how many dead monks."
19 beautifully prepared and looked after bodies, placed among flowers and candles. The dead here are better cared for than most people care for their deceased relatives, let me tell you. They tend their graves regularly for a while, then it's once a week, then once a month, then every year at Christmas the guilt sets in, and they try to clean it up a bit, until they gravel it over."
He shrugged.
"Ring any bells? Have you noticed the state of most cemeteries? Then look at this vault. It is clean, it is tidy, the flowers were changed recently, even the water in the vases doesn't smell, and when do we think all this began? How many years ago?"
The Soko shrugged. "I'm sorry, sir, but I haven't seen the earlier victims, but a long while back, I'd guess. I do take your point, but whoever did this, you can't condone it, surely." Rory looked patiently at the technician.
"Many people agree, myself included, that I am a little eccentric, but apart from extreme cases of euthanasia in the terminally ill, I would never condone the taking of a precious life. I would, however, like to try to understand the psychology of this killer. At least he has shown respect for the human body. He hasn't left his victims like some I have seen, violated and mutilated."
"It takes all sorts, I suppose, even in the world of murderers. But if you'll excuse me, Professor, I really have to go, literally." The Soko hurried off towards the stairs, brushing past Matt as he went. "The Sarge says they'll start the search immediately, and he says thanks, Prof. He owes you one." As Nikki walked through the front doors, she was met by Joseph. "I've hired Tamsin a car. Now I can't be with her 24/7. She just drove in and we grabbed a quick lunch together." "Good idea, but don't leave her on her own for too long." Images of what lay beneath the ground in rows of wooden coffins returned to her. "In fact, why not bring her in here? She could help out in a civilian capacity." Nikki lowered her voice. "Until we get our killer in a secure cell." "I thought of that too, but she's so bloody stubborn," Joseph grumbled, "just like her mother." "Then pull rank. She's young and pretty, and we have a madman right here in Greenborough. I'll clear it with the super. I know she can't be involved in anything sensitive, but she could help the office manager out. Tell her I've specifically asked for her. I'm willing to bet she agrees." They had reached the CID room, and Nikki could barely see the floor for policemen's feet. For once, she had more officers at her disposal than she could ever have dreamed of, but she was still up to her neck in unanswered questions. She looked at Joseph. "Seems like the perfect moment for an update." She walked to the front of the room and rapped on a desk with a stapler. Okay, everyone, just a brief overview if you could listen up. A hush came over the crowded room. The main thing we need to remember is that although the burial chamber has been operational for many years, the last victim was only killed 3 days ago, which is very worrying indeed. Now, she looked across the sea of faces. Has anyone got any news on that relocatable mortuary system? Yes, Ma'am. I've traced several manufacturers and most just hire them out. A young DC flipped over the page of a notepad. Wow, hardly a bouncy castle, is it? They are meant as a means of keeping businesses going during refurbishments of the workplace, Ma'am. So far, I haven't found anyone in this area who has rented or bought one, and although they've emailed all the specs, complete with photographs, I haven't found the exact same model yet. Right, then as soon as you get pictures of ours, email them to all the makers. Maybe someone can identify who made them. Now, how about the chemicals, the formaldehyde or whatever it is? Nothing yet, Gov. I've contacted the people who supply the local funeral directors and embalmers, but you can order the stuff off the internet. The detective sighed, like every other bloody thing these days. Right, but stick with that if you would. How about the candles? Could have got them anywhere, Gov. The discount stores, supermarkets and garden centres are all selling church candles. He's not using any particular brand either, so... The DI nodded. OK, ditch that, and we'll all concentrate on suspects. Joseph, how did you get on this morning? We've seen the owners of the businesses that operate out of the hangars, Ma'am, and although most of them are wetting themselves because of our presence there, no one has stood out as a possible suspect. He smiled, although we've stashed away a fair bit of knowledge about their dodgy activities, and we'll be more than happy to follow that up at a later date. OK. Kat, have you got the lists and those pictures I asked for of our main suspects, our trusty History Society? The detective stood and passed her an envelope. Yes, Ma'am. Full membership list plus photos of the 6 members of the group who are interested in airfields. She attached the 6 photos to the whiteboard. Right, here we have Professor Joshua Flower and his brother Simon Flower, Bill Brewer, Marcus Selby, Frank Kohler and Andrew Fryer. They are all local to Castor Village and are the ones we are interested in. Nikki looked at the team earnestly. I don't need to tell you how fast we have to work. We have a ruthless killer out there who will be seriously pissed off with us. So watch your backs. No matter how beautifully he treats his victims, I don't want any of you to finish up as number 20. Now, I need 3 pairs to go out and have a nice long chat with our historians. I don't want them brought in. I want it done in their own homes. And check out everything you can while you're there. Keep your eyes peeled. I want everything you can dig up on these guys and more. So, Joseph and I will talk to Joshua Flower and his brother Simon. Kat, I suggest that you take Niall with you and visit Marcus Selby and Andrew Fryer. Dave, you take Yvonne and speak to Bill Brewer and Frank Kohler. I want full reports ready for the morning briefing. The rest of you get on with your inquiries and report any findings directly. She paused. Yes, Constable. A WPC had entered the room. Ma'am, Professor Wilkinson wants to speak to you urgently. Can you go back to the scene? Can't I speak to him on the phone? He reckons the phones and the radios are playing up down there, Ma'am, and it's most important that he doesn't leave the crypt. Did he say why, Constable? She had interviews to carry out and really wasn't in the mood for Rory's jokes. Well, to use his words, Ma'am, he thinks he might have just had a jolly chat with the killer. Chapter 19. We were about to let uniform in to look for the hidden door to the lost world. Nikki noted that Rory was far from being his usual self. Matt went off to see the sergeant, and I was left talking to Ahsoka. Or so I thought. He ran his hand through his hair and shook his head. He'd asked to go for a break, and when he didn't return, I got to thinking that something wasn't quite right about him. It was his ID. It was an official ID, but different from ours. So I got one of your men to check the names on the Nottingham team, and there was no Sean Fowler. How the hell did he get in? Nikki almost shook with anger. We have men at every damn point, and no one gets down here without a valid pass. Respectfully, Inspector, I don't think he came in by the front door. I believe he used the entrance that you are so desperately seeking. There are fresh white suits in a convenient pile over there. Simple. Put one on, pull the hood over your head, and voila, we all look the same. I gathered that from your remarkable description, she said testily. Yes, rather good, wasn't it? A man of medium, slightly taller than average height, wearing a white all-in-one disposable suit,
Hair colour unknown, eye colour distorted by artificial light, no distinguishing marks or features, and no discernible accent. He grinned hopelessly. Not much to go on, but I swear I'd know him again. Nikki threw up her hands in despair. And how the hell would you do that? You said it yourself. We all look the same in these bloody suits. There was something about him. It was as if he was searching, probing your mind for something, and sadly I think he may have found something in mine. Rory pushed his glasses up and massaged the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. I have a strong and rather disconcerting feeling that we will meet again. Nikki drove back to the station, worried because Rory had dug his heels in about not leaving the crypt. She had increased security, but still feared for his safety. She just hoped that his colleague would get a move on and give him a break, before he either cracked or met up with his friendly scene of crime officer again. Joseph had waited for her to return before interviewing the Flower brothers, and she told him about Rory's encounter as they drove to Casterfen village. Shit, so he returned to his killing ground, breathed Joseph. With considerable ease, he strolled in through his other entrance, the one he knows about and we bloody well don't. I wonder why. Joseph stared out across acres of freshly ploughed fields. Because they do. It's well documented that killers feel the need to return to the scene, and maybe he just needed to see for himself what was going on. Nikki eased her car around a winding bend, and then accelerated onto the straight road. She glanced hopefully across to Joseph. Any further forward with Find and Eve? All this has caused something of a hold-up, although Tam is still hard at it. Nikki thought he sounded mildly evasive, but perhaps she was just tired. I rang her with your proposition, and you were right. She'll be coming in with me tomorrow. He shook his head, which, believes me, feels sincerely weird. A good kind of weird. Very good, Mom. Next left and we're into Casterfen village. Half an hour later, they sat outside the Flowers' home. The meeting with Joshua Flower had brought up nothing that they could use, and as his brother was at work, they had promised to return later that evening to interview Simon. Any thoughts? Nikki chewed on the end of her pen. Intelligent, academic, well-off, an interesting chap to listen to. Made a change to hear someone stringing a full sentence together without a swear word. Or am I spending too much time in the mess room? Probably. I admit he's interesting, but after a while he begins to get up my nose. I don't like the way he lectures you rather than just answering the questions. Force of habit. It was his job, wasn't it? And he knows that airfield very well. Too well? Joseph turned and looked at her. Surely you don't think he's our man. He's charming. I thought serial killers were without social graces, emotionless. That's how come they can do the dreadful things that they do. Depends how clever they are. Some blend in with society by being cunning mimics. Yes, but... Joseph seemed honestly shocked that Nikki was so suspicious about Joshua. He's too... what do I mean? He interacts too well, and he's honestly passionate about history. I just can't buy into the murder a bit. You're probably right. Nikki massaged the back of her neck to ease the tense muscles. What's getting to me is the fact that our History Society, with all their maps and books and historical tomes, and knowing all they do about that place, have completely missed that bloody great underground chapel. It's huge, damn it. Well, someone certainly knew about it, didn't they? And has done for decades. I'll be glad when we start to get some solid forensic results, dates and stuff, like when he first killed. That's going to take time. I don't envy our pathologist right now, do you? You do know he's got a sleeping bag down there, and a camp bed. You're kidding. God, I'd never have put our Rory down as having balls. You wouldn't get me staying down there for all the tea in China. He seems quite at home. Now you're really worrying me. He pulled a horrified face. Nikki smiled. The poor sod looks like a ghost himself. I've warned him, but he refuses to budge until his forensic mate gets there. Nikki started the car. Time to get back. I'll be interested to hear what the others have turned up. Dave pulled into the curb, parked under a massive horse-chestnut tree, and tried to picture the man they were going to interview. He remembered a slight accent that he couldn't quite place, and that Kohler had been very polite, even if he did possess piercing, sharp eyes that looked unnervingly straight into yours. When he had seen him at the airfield, Dave had noticed that the man was wearing one blue and one green sock, which led him to believe that he was single and colourblind. Dave looked across at Yvonne and said, Before we go in, what do we actually know about Frank Kohler? No record, not even a speeding ticket. Yvonne had swung the door open and was getting out. He has a half-sister living with him, name of Irene Kohler. Apparently she goes to the History Society meetings occasionally. Again, squeaky clean. She looked across at Dave. These aren't the kind of people that we usually get called out to see, unless there's been an attempted burglary or something like that. They are certainly not the shady sorts that fill our days, are they? Dave glanced up at the high gables and leaded windows, then rang the bell. And this doesn't look like the sort of place to house a family of villains, does it? How about a murderer? Asked Yvonne darkly. Pass, but perhaps we should keep an eye open for bottles of arsenic in the wine rack. There was a sound of an interior door closing. Then, through the coloured glass, a shadowy figure could be seen approaching. Frank Kohler stood to one side, and the 2 police officers entered. I got your call, but Irene is out. She works in the cancer research charity shop some afternoons. Dave decided that the hint of accent was German. Can I get you a drink? That would be very nice, sir, said Dave, wanting to use every moment that the man was out of sight to get a good look around. Coffee, please. Tea for me, if it's not too much trouble, added Yvonne with a smile. Kohler went to put the kettle on, and Dave took in the high ceiling with the deep ornate coving and central boss, the long casement windows with the expensive drapes, and the kind of furniture that had history attached to it, not a 0% finance agreement. Family money, he whispered to Yvonne. Must be. You'd need more than the chief constable earns for all this. Yvonne looked around, and her eyes fell on a gilt-framed picture over the fireplace. Look at that. I'm no expert, but that looks pretty authentic to me. You obviously have a discerning eye for quality, Constable. Kohler appeared in the doorway. Because you're quite right. It's a Victorian artist, not wildly famous, but quite collectible by lovers of the idealists. He walked across to a winged armchair and sat, looking from one police officer to the other. So, how can I help? Dave began. You probably know that the airfield is cordoned off at present. My neighbour rang to tell me. Is it something to do with the owner's death? Not exactly. There has been a significant discovery at Flaxton Mere. The man looked perplexed. Oh, like what? We are not at liberty to say, sir, but it is being treated as a murder inquiry, and we can tell you that another secret chamber has been discovered. Good God, but I've been doing historical research out there for years. Where did you find it? He seemed genuinely surprised. Sorry, sir, I can't say exactly where at present. Dave looked apologetic. Well, that place is full of surprises, isn't it? Apparently, Mr. Kohler. And as you are one of the few people who have a working knowledge of it, I'm afraid we need to ask you some questions. The man stood. Let me get the drinks. As he left the room, Dave followed him, making admiring comments about the house and allowing Yvonne to take a closer look at the room. So, is it just you and your sister live here, sir? Half-sister. We shared the same father. And yes, it is just us. I'm sure some would think it's a waste of such a big house, but so long as we can afford to look after it, that's how it will remain. It's our family home. And a very beautiful one, sir. I'm sure I'd feel the same. Dave knew damn well he would, if he lived in a mansion like this. You've lived here all your life, then? Almost, since I was a boy. My father was from Munich, but he had to leave Germany when the war began. He paused, then added, political reasons. What did your father do for a living, sir? This house would not have come cheap, even all that time ago. His family were certainly not poor, officer. He left in considerable haste, but he did have enough time to arrange his finances. He was a master craftsman, a cabinet maker. You will see the proof of his expertise throughout the house. They walked back to the sitting room, Dave talking loudly to alert Yvonne to their return. And your profession, sir? Dave gingerly accepted the bone china cup and saucer, wishing it was a mug, something more suited to his chunky fingers. Antiques. I buy and sell. Most of my sales are through the internet or auctions. And your interest in Flaxton Mere? Via the History Society. We were the only ones to discover that it had an interesting wartime history.
ones that had been buried until we began ferreting through the archives. He frowned and stared directly at Dave. Am I some kind of suspect for whatever has happened? We need the help of all the members of your group, not just yourself. The interview went on until Dave raised an eyebrow at Yvonne. They were getting nothing of use. They thanked Cola and left. In the car outside, Yvonne pulled a face and closed her notebook. Nothing much of value there, was there? Other than the Victorian idolists, that is, and the porcelain, and the furniture. Nothing obvious, and he really seemed shocked to hear about the inquiry. Still, you never know. Where to next? The Brewers. They live on the other side of the green, the house on the corner of the lane that goes out to the fen. Bill Brewer and his wife Margaret sat next to each other on a large, comfortless sofa. Their eyes were huge, and they often answered together, or split their sentences between them, making the interview seem disjointed and slightly frenetic. We've been going there for 15 years at least, maybe. More like 20. It's been our hobby, you see. William's parents left hundreds of old photos. Local stuff, all pertaining to this area. Mostly wartime pictures. Dave was starting to feel slightly dizzy, and decided that if they were the killers, they had most likely bored their victims to death. The interview lasted about half an hour, and he and Yvonne came away with dazed expressions. If it wasn't so bloody serious, they would have laughed. Dave pulled at his seatbelt, then saw Kat and Niall hurrying across the green towards them. He wound down his window. Anything interesting? Kat shrugged. Nothing too exciting, although that Andrew Fry bloke is well odd. His mother said he had a head injury years ago, and it affected his brain, so it's hard to tell if he's experiencing neurological problems or is just plain creepy. I'd definitely settle for creepy, and that other chap, Selby. Niall gave Dave and Yvonne an exasperated grin. Phew, he's a right pain in the arse, plus he's mega pissed off that we've discovered a part of the airfield that he doesn't know about. That's true, added Kat. That seemed to bother him more than the fact that we were conducting a murder investigation. Dave narrowed his eyes. You don't think the anger was actually because we've discovered a part of the airfield that he does know about? We wondered that, but on reflection we don't think so. He just seemed pig sick that after a couple of hours on the fen, a pair of flat-footed coppers unearthed something that years of historical investigation have missed. Understandable, I suppose, but I'd definitely make a note of his reaction when you write up your report. Certainly will, my friend. Kat indicated back towards their vehicle. But it's time we were heading back to base, because our two trusty coppers here have a little job of their own to attend to tonight out on Flaxton Mere. Niall nodded and threw Yvonne a knowing look. We sure have. See you at the Nick. Dave watched them go. He silently wondered if the murders were the work of a complete unknown, a lone Fenlander who had walked that particular stretch of marshy waterworld from his youth, a homegrown killer. As he drove back to base, he decided to ask the boss if maybe they should look closer at some of the old locals, the Webfoots that have a particular love for their remote and eerie homeland. Dave shivered and decided there was nothing more dangerous than a faceless adversary. Chapter 20. 2 hours later, Nikki and Joseph had returned to the comfortable house in Castor Fen village, and were sitting once again in Joshua Flower's study, surrounded by the same books and the same paintings, but opposite a different flower. Simon, like his brother, expressed total incredulity at their discovering another underground chamber. Frankly, Inspector, if anyone should know about it, it should be me. I'm the canary that they send down the pit to see if it's safe. This is an awesome discovery. Can you tell me where it is? Nikki looked at Joseph, then shrugged and nodded. One look at the concentration of uniforms out on the marsh would tell him the answer to that one anyway. Below one of the pillboxes on the marsh side of the airfield. He shook his head in amazement. Well, he let out a low whistle. All I can think is that I've rarely paid much attention to the pillboxes. Once you've ascertained what they were protecting and what their design and armament was, that's it, really. His expression changed to one of exasperation. Damn it! I really should have known. There's an escape route for the main bunker. It had a tunnel that had since been sealed, but it ran from the bunker to just outside the perimeter fence and directly to a pillbox, a specially designed one that was actually a concealed exit. They must have used the same camouflage, only the one you discovered was not an exit but an entrance. He let out an irritated growl. Why the hell didn't I make the connection? Nikki watched his reaction with interest.
Mr. Flower, the underground chamber was not purpose-built at the time of World War II. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the RAF. It's very old, and apparently part of a monastery that stood on the site hundreds of years ago. The man's brow folded into furrows. Really? I'd have thought it was part of the war installation, but then again it shouldn't surprise me. If you recall, D.S. Easter, I showed your daughter Tamsin one of the monks' tunnels that led out to the marsh. If that tiny chapel could remain intact, then so could others. He dropped his head, then lifted his eyes and looked hopefully at Nikki. Do you think I could see it? It's a crime scene, Mr. Flower. That's not possible. I work crime scenes all the time, Detective. I'm with the fire service, remember? We often attend cases of suspected arson. I'm sorry, but there are aspects of this case that we're not making public yet. 19 of them, to be precise, thought Nikki. However, we may ask for your help later on. She weighed him up, and knowing his history with the emergency services, decided to tell him a little more than they had the others. We suspect there is another way in, Simon. A back door, so to speak, although so far we haven't found it. So why do you think it exists? His grey-blue eyes held a sharp intelligence. Let's say that the crypt contains items that would have been difficult to manoeuvre down steep steps. Really? He stared at her shrewdly. Nikki could see that he was desperate to know what these items were, but no way was she going to tell him that. Well, I'd be glad to help any time. Up until tonight, I believed that I knew more than anyone about that place. Now it seems I was wrong. He bit anxiously on his lip. But even so, I'm more than willing to help you look for this alternative entrance, and I do have quite a bit of previous knowledge of the place to call upon. Nikki nodded, and we might be very grateful for that once our preliminary searches are complete. Meanwhile, when we called earlier, we asked your brother to provide us with a potted history of RAF Flaxton Mere. Anything you can add would be much appreciated. As their canary, you have probably trodden paths that the others have not. I'll certainly give it some thought, Inspector. Will that be all? For now, sir. Thank you. As night closed in, the mysterious lights of the jack-o'-lantern once again danced across the marshy ground of Flaxton Mere, and on the wind from the sea, terrible noises could be heard. Moans and wailing voices, screams and cries that could turn the unsuspecting traveller's blood to ice. Except that this time, the show was being mounted courtesy of PC Niall Farrow and WPC Yvonne Collins. It had taken an hour, with 3 uniformed constables and a dog, to locate the powerful lamp, the sound system, and the automatic switchgear that activated it. Then, having discovered the lamp, they traced the electrical lead down into a shaft, not unlike the one that poor Pike had taken a dive into. For some time they tramped down a long sloping passageway until they came to a carefully hidden door beneath the control tower, and that, to their amazement, led down a long, high tunnel to the back of the burial chamber. By 10 o'clock that evening, D.I. Nikki Galena had her back door. Stuart! Rory almost fell into the white-suited arms of his old university friend. Jesus Christ on a bike, Wilkinson. You look like shit. You always did know how to make a guy feel special, Dr. Bass. The forensic archaeologist put down his flight bag and did a 360-degree take on the chamber. When you said this trip would be worth my while, I had my doubts. He frowned admonishingly at his friend, especially when it came to leaving my beautiful and now somewhat irate bride in the middle of our honeymoon. But bloody hell, you weren't joking, were you? It needs to be seen to be appreciated, doesn't it? Although I'm not too sure said lovely young bride would agree with me. Bass moved across to the second chamber, and his eyes widened at the sight of the stone shelves stacked with coffins. Now, that's what I call a library. Slightly macabre genre of books in the collection, don't you think? This is jaw-dropping, gobsmacking marvel, Rory. He turned back to his friend, his large brown eyes sparkling with excitement. How do we get a strong coffee around here? I need to kill the jet lag and hear the story before I start work. Rory would have liked just a little of his friend's energy. I'll get one of the lads to go to the late-night garage. They sell half-edible doughnuts, too. I think I need a sugar hit, and I'm afraid I can't actually leave the scene for a bit. Sit down here. He pointed to a wide stone step, and I'll explain. Stuart had begun work even before the doughnuts arrived. I think that if the police extend their search, they will find a store of some kind stacked with plain coffins. His large physique was surprisingly graceful. He moved from coffin to coffin, scaled the tower athletically and with considerable elegance. "Taking on board what you've told me about the original plans for this airfield, I would expect at least 100 coffins stored somewhere." He swung to the ground. "Strangely enough, I've seen a similar thing once before." Rory found the energy to look mildly astonished. "An underground fallout shelter was being stripped out prior to a massive rebuild. It was beneath some old government buildings. It dated back to the 50s or 60s and the Cold War, a time when the fear of a nuclear attack gave rise to all sorts of frightful ideas on how to prevent the rich and important from being vaporized. Well, sadly for the contractors, they found a grave. It turned out to be Roman, but it put a temporary hold on their excavations. Anyway, they had a coffin store too." "But I thought they used papier-mâché and cardboard coffins during the war." "They did, but only because back in the 1930s it had been calculated that if the Luftwaffe launched what was called the knockout blow, it would be such a huge air attack that in the first 3 months they would require 60,000 square feet of coffin timber. I think by the time this place was getting up and running, the military had more faith in the RAF and perhaps a wish for something a little more substantial than papier-mâché to be buried in." "Would they have used local people to construct them?" "Doubtful. This was a secret project, although the timber might have been sourced from a local merchant." "Something for our detectives to check out, I suppose." Stuart looked at Rory, his head slightly to one side. "I know you were knackered beyond words, but something else is worrying you, isn't it?" "Oh, did I forget to mention that the killer called by yesterday? We had a nice little chat about this and that, then he left for a pee, and I haven't seen him since." Stuart looked sideways at the pathologist. "Right, fine. Any chance of running that by me again, this time with a tad more information attached?" Rory did his best to explain. "You actually spoke to a mass murderer?" "No, I actually spoke to a serial killer. Mass murderers kill randomly, like the Hungerford Massacre." "Don't split hairs, Wilkinson. You know exactly what I mean." Stuart's dark eyebrows almost met in the middle as he mock-frowned at Rory. Perhaps I just don't like to think about it too deeply right now, as our main objective is to give our detectives some dates, like when Matey Boy here began his life's work. I suppose we had better crack on. Have you got another hour left in you, or would you prefer to start afresh in the morning?" "Lord, if you can keep going, oh pasty-faced apparition, I'm bloody sure I can." Chapter 21. Nikki was opening the morning meeting. "There have been a few developments overnight, so listen up. 1, we now have our alternative entrance into the underground chambers, so we know how all the mortuary equipment was brought in. And that is thanks to the ingenuity of PC Niall Farrow and WPC Yvonne Collins. Also thanks to them, we now know about a series of deterrents, or people scarers. Our killer has been keeping visitors away with a load of clever little tricks to repel the inquisitive and the unwelcome. The superstitious are treated to lights on the marsh, audio tapes of aircraft, wartime sirens, and general carnage and destruction, and a light show that, seen from a distance, resembles flickering flames." "I knew that scenario was somehow familiar," said Yvonne. "An air raid was one of Miss Quinny's favourite complaints a while back. I should have remembered it was her that mentioned it." "But how's he done all that, Ma'am?" asked a uniformed officer. "Flaxton Mere is hardly a Pinewood set, is it?" "He's had plenty of time, and he's smart. So far, we have located 2 petrol-driven generators and some pretty hefty battery-powered ghetto blaster-type sound systems with timers." She stopped for a moment, considering some of these, then continued. "Have you ever seen those upmarket irrigation systems for watering lawns? The ones that disappear down into the turf so you can mow over them? Well, he's used that principle, but instead of sprays, he has hollow pipes that conduct sound. Yvonne and Niall tried them out, and depending on what you fancy sending through them, they're damned eerie." "Yes," added Niall grimly. "It's no wonder Pike nearly died of fright, and that the locals reckon the fen is haunted. It is, but not by ghosts." "It should be. There are enough bloody bodies underneath it." Bob Tinker's half-joke sounded hollow. "Thank you for your input, PC Tinker. Our psychologist, Richard Foley, is studying the info we have in order to give us an idea of what kind of person we are looking for. You will be updated as soon as that information is available." She glanced at a sheaf of notes that lay on her desk. "We have interviewed the History Society members.
She frowned. But none of them leapt out as being first-class suspects. However, they all deserve careful scrutiny, as they are the ones closest to the airfield, and they are also pretty desperate to get a protection order on it. What about the new bloke who got top, Mom? Carl Shine? He knew the place. After all, he did own it. Perhaps someone knew what he was up to and got in first. Not very likely. These killings began way before Shine's time. What about the people who work for those hangars, Mom? There's not a straight one among them. Nikki shook her head. Joseph has checked all of them. They only started renting when Shine bought into the airfield. Again, they're too recent. So, it looks like either an old-time local or one of the history group, said Dave. I agree, so dig deep with all of them. Forget the genteel exteriors and find me some dirt. I want to know everything about them and their families, both living and dead, going back at least 2 generations, okay? Mum? Kat looked up at her boss. What about suiting them up in forensics overalls and getting Professor Wilkinson to see if he recognises one of them? If he really did talk to the killer, something might give him away. I've already put that to Rory. He's happy to give it a try, but the killer could disguise his voice or his general demeanour. He's too clever, and he's been getting away with murder for around 2 decades, so... She looked at the young detective. Sorry to be negative, but think about it. The killer was wearing a mask, a scene suit, gloves and plastic shoe protectors, all in poor light. I know Rory said he would know him if he saw him again, and in a one-to-one unprepared situation, some small gesture or intonation of speech just might give him away, but not in a lineup. And I've already shown him the photos of all the male members of the History Society, and none of them were familiar to him. Poor Rory is exhausted. Frankly, I don't think he'd recognise his own mother in poor light and a hooded suit, do you? She looked around the room at the sea of serious faces. By the end of the day, we should have something better to go on, some idea of a timescale and hopefully a profile of the killer. Meanwhile, I want all your energies directed towards tearing that History Society apart. So go to it. Tamsin sat on the other side of her father's desk. You haven't told her what Tug Owen said, have you? How can I, Tam? She's run ragged with this investigation, and she still has her father's funeral next week to cope with. Oh, I agree. I just wondered if you wanted me to keep on digging around to see where Eve might have disappeared to. Tug reckoned they parted on bad terms, but when he realised that he'd goofed, Nikki's father went looking for her. Okay, so he never found her, but with these wonderful inventions, she indicated the computer, there's a good chance that I may be able to track down something about her. She looked at him hopefully, and I can do that right here, on my laptop. Well, if Nikki hasn't given you anything special to do, you go ahead. Dad, I have to ask this before I start. Knowing what you found in that crypt, and considering that Eve went missing after working at Flaxton Mere, do you think she might be one of the victims? Joseph moved closer to his daughter and whispered, I've thought of little else since talking with Tug. I'm going to ask the pathologist if they found a woman of her possible age and description. Then give him this. Tamsin passed him a print-out photo. I enhanced her image from the picture Nikki found in her father's book. Joseph stared at the printout of Eve. It was easy to see why Nikki's father had been attracted to her. Even without the bond of shared trauma, there was definitely something very attractive about her. You can see it too, murmured Tamsin, although I can't fathom what it is. Maybe she looks like one of those gorgeous actresses in old wartime films. Joseph folded the sheet and pushed it into his pocket. I'll go and see Rory as soon as, although, with the workload, I'm not sure when that'll be. Don't sweat it, Dad. Tamsin returned to her laptop. There's plenty of time. Joseph felt his heart give a little lurch, and he sincerely hoped there was. For you, sir. Niall appeared with an armful of paperwork. He looked from Joseph to Tamsin and grinned. Have you joined the force too? Tamsin smiled at him. No fear, I'm under house arrest, actually. Joseph gave his daughter a withering look, then turned to Niall. Can I ask a favour? Without waiting for a reply, he said, If Tamsin needs to go out to the cafe or anything, would you tag along with her? Show her around? Niall nodded quickly. No problem, sir. Be my pleasure. Tamsin glowered at her father. I'm not a child. At home I walk the streets of Chicago at night without a bodyguard, so I hardly need one here. Oh, do you? I'll worry about that at a later date, but as Greenborough has a psychotic killer roaming its streets, I think it's one up on Chicago right now, thank you. Lesage has a point. So humorous, yes? Niall turned on a dazzling smile. Tamsin shook her head in disgust, but didn't argue. Joseph noticed a wry smile hovering on her lips. By the way, Niall, that was a damn good job out on the marsh. Joseph clapped him on the shoulder. Well done to you and your crewmate. Finding that entrance was a stroke of pure genius, and I'm sure it's helped to speed up the inquiry. Nice one. Niall glowed red, and managed to splutter that it was nothing really. After he had left, Joseph said, partly to himself and partly to his daughter, "That lad has the makings of a damned good police officer. He has all the right instincts. He could go far, given the right breaks." Tamsin did not answer, but Joseph had noticed that her eyes had followed PC Niall Farrow all the way out of the room. By late morning, the Undercroft had taken on a very different appearance. The Sokos had removed every trace of evidence that had been left behind, and using the killer's own mortuary table and several portable units of their own, the two forensic scientists had set up a passable on-site field station. The two most recent victims had been moved directly to the mortuary, but all the others were being carefully examined in the makeshift underground laboratory. Stuart Bass was as excited by this strange chamber of death as he had been about any archaeological dig that he could remember, and as the hours went by, the more elated he became. "Looks like 3 distinct periods of usage, Rory." He was swinging from the top of the tower and investigating a series of hooks embedded deep into the ceiling of the burial chapel. "These were the original fittings for a simple block and tackle that allowed the monks to haul the coffins up to the higher tier. So we have the resting place of the holy order that built the monastery. Then it would seem from the later plain coffins that the military used it for some purpose, probably storage. I'm damn sure they didn't embalm their dead and place them on display. The casualties of war would have been recorded and buried in a far corner of the airfield designated as a cemetery. And now we have its last use, someone's personal chapel of rest. Last but one, Wilkinson. Right now it's a field path lab." "Ah, yes, and I keep wondering what our killer thought about it when he paid me that impromptu visit." "Well, you are probably not number 1 on his favourites list right now." "Hardly. Trampling all over his sanctum sanctorum." "Better keep looking over your shoulder then, my friend." Bass was only half joking. "I think the time has come to tell you that I didn't invite you here entirely for your valued academic brain. I actually required your muscular body to watch my back." "Well, if that's the case, we'd better order another camp bed, hadn't we?" "If nothing else, ma'am, our songbird Pike is singing like a good un." PC Bob Tinker had just returned from the hospital. "I've turned everything over to the narcotics team. They're ecstatic over some of the info he's coughed up." "Anything to get off the hook, huh?" Nikki didn't like Pike, but then she didn't like anyone involved in the drug world. "To be honest, I believe he's had enough of the street life, ma'am. Maybe the hoods didn't get to his gran, but that was only because of divine intervention. If she hadn't had that heart attack, God knows what they would have done to her. Several people saw a dark car out there the next day. It had to be them, and Pike is well shaken by the old thing." "And do we know who them are?" "A couple of low-life goons who collect from bad debtors, but we aren't sure who they are in the pay of." "Then keep a very close eye on Pike." Nikki's eyes narrowed. "Those goons will be after him." She paused. "Has Pike been told about his friend Anson Taylor yet?" "Did it myself, ma'am." Bob Tinker drew in a breath. "I know he's a right little scrope, but I did feel a bit sorry for him. He's still facing a possible amputation. His granny has died, and now his best mate, well, actually his only mate, has been snuffed. He's not having the best of times." "Then let's hope having to deal with serious trauma really does drag him onto the straight and narrow, shall we?" As Tinker left, Joseph came through the door. "Thought you should know that we've had a partial ID on the dark-haired victim from the crypt." Nikki looked up from her paperwork. "Really? That was quick." Joseph pulled a face. "Well, it's not much, but one of the engineers from the dodgy lockups recognised the photo of the dead man as one of Carl Shine's surveyors." "Do we know who they are yet? What company?" "No, but as all of their vehicles were unmarked, allegedly none of the men were communicative, and they disappeared like the morning mist when we came on the scene. I'd say they were very unofficial, wouldn't you?" And there was no paperwork regarding surveyors at Shine's home. Nikki leaned back in her chair. So what did our illegal surveyor do to get himself murdered, I wonder? She frowned. Let's think about this. On the surface, it looks as if our killer took out Carl Shine because he was planning on developing the airfield, doesn't it? Yes, and maybe the surveyor discovered something that he wasn't meant to, then he told Shine, so the killer had to dispose of both. But that's not right, is it? He certainly killed and lovingly embalmed the dark-haired man, but Carl was brutally murdered and left in his car to rot. Our killer takes great care of his victims. Shine was assassinated, terminated professionally, and unless I'm way off track, this is a completely separate murder. Oh, lovely. Welcome to friendly Greenborough, home to countless murders. Joseph dropped his head into his hands and groaned loudly. Chapter 22. As the day wore on, Nikki found her thoughts returning again and again to the underground mortuary table. She shuddered every time she thought about it. Why couldn't they trace it? For heaven's sake, people didn't just go out and buy a relocatable mortuary like they would a new dining room table. They were highly specialized pieces of equipment, and with the internet, they should have been able to easily pinpoint manufacturer, design, model, and supplier, but they'd found zilch. Joseph joined her sometime after 4 o'clock and flopped down onto a chair. We've got nothing new. We've scanned the backgrounds of all the possible suspects, and no one has the slightest connection with the funeral trade. And as Rory said, the art of embalming does not exactly feature next to model planes and embroidery in the craft and hobby magazines. Rory also said the killer was a master professional, so maybe he's someone we haven't even spoken to yet. Nikki closed the file that she was working on. Dave thinks it's some local man that we've overlooked. We've been so involved with the History Society that maybe we're missing something. She stared out through the office window. Where's Tamsin? She declared that she couldn't last another 10 minutes without a skinny latte, so Niall Farrow has taken her round to the Café des Amis. Nikki threw him a tired smile. I suspect a little bit of chemistry there, don't you? Joseph's face creased into a grin. Now wouldn't that be a turn-up for the books? My Tamsin associating with the enemy. He looked concerned momentarily, and I can only guess what her mother Laura would think about that. I think Tamsin's mellowing. I'd like to think the same, but I'm scared to. Hang on in there, my friend. I get the feeling that things will turn out well with you two. Just have patience. As Niall placed 2 white china cups on the table, Tamsin looked at him with interest. He was the kind of guy you couldn't help liking, but there was something more about him, something she found quite attractive. He seemed to be quite unaware that he was drop-dead gorgeous, and he had a fire of enthusiasm inside him. She recognized it from something that burned in her own soul. She always appreciated passion when she saw it. She just wasn't quite sure how anyone could be passionate about being a copper. You look pretty pleased with yourself when my father said you'd done well. Niall grinned. It meant a lot. Why? The young officer sat down opposite her. He looked surprised. Because your dad is something of a hero around here, Tamsin. To get an accolade from him is, well, a really cool thing to happen. Tamsin silently took what he had said on board and stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Have you always wanted to be a policeman? Never thought of anything else. He gave Tamsin a long, thoughtful look, and she decided that he was debating whether to tell her more. After a while, he said, When I was a lad, my dad was working a late shift at the factory, and my elder brother had taken my sister down to the chippy to get our supper. He stared into his coffee for a while, then went on. So I was on my own when the police arrived. I was 8 years old, and my father had just been killed in an accident at work. Some machinery malfunctioned and... He took a deep breath and left that part of the story untold. I never forgot how kind the police officers were, or how well they handled the situation, and the care they took of us. From that day, I knew exactly what I would be when I left school. His face broke into a grin. From day one I loved it, and when they finally teamed me up with Vonnie, I thought all my Christmases had come at once. I like Yvonne. So is she a hero too? Niall leaned closer to Tamsin. Vonnie is a legend. For the next few minutes, he regaled her with stories of Yvonne's brilliant street policing career. And she has the Queen's Commendation for bravery, but you'll never hear that from her. She'd tell you she was just doing her job. Niall shook his head. Thing is, though I love being a beat bobby, I want to get into CID. My goal is to get onto your dad's team. Apart from your father, D.I. Galena is top cop in my book. He sipped his coffee, and most of the station would agree with me.
So what makes them different from other teams? Asked Tamsin.
Niall didn't hesitate. Respect, Tam. They've both earned respect from the men and women they work with, and that doesn't happen easily, believe me. Tamsin recalled the last time she had been in Greenborough, when another murder case had been hanging over Nikki's head. Tamsin had not really been around long enough, but even then she had picked up on some unspoken bond that the team had. Did you know that both the DI and your dad were offered promotion last year?
Tamsin frowned. He never mentioned it. Why didn't they take it?
For the sake of the team. They decided that things were too good to mess with. Promotion would have meant big changes. See what I mean about loyalty?
As they walked back to the station, Tamsin began to wonder if it was time to put the past behind her. She had seen her father only 3 times in the last 3 years, and she knew that he was a different man to the zealous soldier he had once been. She had never believed that leopards could change their spots, but from what she'd seen for herself, and from what she'd heard from people like Niall, maybe she had been wrong. As the police station came into view, Tamsin decided that she wanted to forget about the times her father had left them to go kill people, and all the times that he had put his army career before their happiness, but she wasn't sure that she could. She would try. After all, that was why she was here, but... Before we go in... Niall touched her arm lightly. Look, this is probably not the best time to ask, knowing that we're involved in the biggest and nastiest case any of us have ever seen, but would you fancy coming out for a drink with me later? Tamsin hoped that she looked calm and just a little indifferent. Niall was a cool guy, but she didn't want to lead him on. After all, she would be returning to the States in the not-too-distant future. Still, a drink wouldn't exactly hurt now, would it? If you like.
Niall grinned at her. Great. Let me put your number into my phone. He opened his phone and quickly punched in the numbers that she gave him. I'll ring you later, then you can pick up my details. He opened the door for her, and they went inside, talking easily together. Back at her desk, Tamsin decided that perhaps it hadn't been such a bad idea to work with her father, after all. As night clouds moved slowly across the sky, the men and women working out on Flaxton Mere began to get jumpy. It was not a happy place in bright sunshine, but at night, even knowing that the ghostly lights and eerie noises had been man-made, it was miserable. Maybe it was made worse by the fact that the Mere had been used in such an evil way, that the sinister goings-on had been engineered by a psychotic killer, and the knowledge that he was still on the loose. She's out there again, Sarge. What can I do, apart from slapping her in a cell? Reg had seen a ghostly figure drifting around the airfield. After conquering a major attack of the horrors, he realized it was the sister of the dead dealer, Anson Taylor. He had tried to reason with her, but she had simply said that she couldn't rest and wanted to be close to where her brother had died. Get her home again, Reg, and tell her to see a doctor. She needs a sedative or something, but they're no relatives. She shouldn't be alone. Just a father that she hates, and I know why. He knocked her mother around and abused her too, but when he started on her kid brother, Steph came to us. Good for her, that took guts. The sergeant shrugged his broad shoulders. Well, I've got no answers, Reg. Just get her home, I guess. It's all we can do. Couldn't we let her stay for a bit, sir? Now we know it's not the lady in white and she's not doing any harm. I get the feeling she'll only keep coming back. Then talk to her again. But if she stays, she's your responsibility, and make sure you take her with you when your shift is over, all right? Reg thanked his sergeant and walked off towards the pale, unkempt figure that sat on a grassy mound a little way from the pillbox. He sat down beside her, and together they stared at the floodlit structure. When he told her that she could stay until he went off duty, she placed an ice-cold hand on his and croaked a pitiful thank you. It made Reg wonder what the hell life was all about. Nikki and Joseph sat in the tiny kitchen in Knott Cottage, sipped cold white wine, and ate a bowl of tuna pasta that Joseph had quickly put together when they got home. It was after 9:30, and as Nikki had forgotten to shop again, she was glad of the impromptu supper. "What time is Tamsin due back?" she asked, wiping a slice of garlic bread around her empty dish. "Niall said he'd have her back by 10. We all need our sleep. Sleep doesn't come easy knowing there's a killer out there. Plus the timing stinks. You still have your father's funeral to worry about, and I've got Tamsin to stay with me for the first time since she was in school uniform." They talked for a while about the case. Then Joseph took the dishes and placed them in the dishwasher. "Are you all right in the farmhouse alone, Nikki?" He looked at her anxiously. I mean, I know you're as tough as old boots, but these are extraordinary times. Tam and I could come and stay over. I'd offer our hospitality here, but 1 loo, 2 bedrooms, and 3 of us could be interesting. Nikki yawned. I'm fine, Joseph, but thanks. And if I spook myself at 3 a.m, I promise that I'll make up the spare beds, okay? Do that. Joseph walked to the window and looked along the lane. Then he glanced at his watch. I'm beginning to wish I'd told them to leave this date until we were less stretched. Young people don't have much idea of time, do they? Nikki checked her own watch. It's only 10 past, and at their age I don't think I cared too much about curfews either. If there wasn't a murderer loose, I'd agree. He ran his hand through his hair, in a gesture Nikki had noticed that Tamsin had inherited. Niall's a sensible lad, and he worships you, so he's not going to blow it on his first date with the sergeant's daughter now, is he? I guess not. Joseph gave a short laugh. By the way, Tamsin asked me about our refusing promotion. It seems that Niall told her that we did it to hold the team together. I think it made something of an impression on her. Nikki smiled at him. Good. Of course, turning down promotion wasn't entirely because of the work dynamic, and they both knew it. They had reached a watershed moment in their relationship, and they were scared. Too scared to lose what they had, and too scared to change anything. And so they had drawn a line under any form of moving forward, personally and in the workplace. And here they were, a year on, and still too scared to rock the boat. Joseph settled back in his favourite chair, and his smile faded. Nikki, I don't know about you, but I'm having trouble getting my head around the sheer scale of this case. You read about prolific serial killers, but somehow they don't seem real, do they? And here we are in the middle of the Fens with one of the worst cases this country has ever seen. Someone has deliberately taken all those lives, year after year. It's like some horrible, gruesome hobby that has existed alongside his normal life, whatever that is. I know what you mean. It feels totally surreal. But it does happen. I was given a paper to read once about Victorian murderers, not just Jack the Ripper, but there was this woman, Amelia Dyer. They called her the Angel Maker. And she murdered 400 babies before they caught and hanged her. Now that totally scrambled my brain. I've seen some terrible things, Nikki, in the military. A shadow seemed to fall across his face. Things I never want to see again, but something like this is so... Joseph fought for words. So devious, so... sick? He's a predator, and he's been living among us, preying on innocent human beings and taking them to his own private house of horrors. If this were an episode of Tales from the Crypt, no one would believe it. Well, he won't be taking any other poor souls down there, thank God. Nikki yawned. Sorry, Joseph. I really should go, but I want to know that Tamsin is safe. You go. You look all in. If you like, I'll ring you when she comes home. Nikki stood up and pulled on her jacket. Maybe I should. I'm out on my feet and we need to be back at work at the crack of dawn. She took her car keys from her pocket. Thanks for supper, Joseph. I appreciate it. And don't forget to ring me. The chilly night air brushed her face as she stepped outside, and to her relief, she saw headlight beams swinging round off the road. I guess we worried for nothing. A palpable wave of relief came from Joseph. Crisis averted. As Nikki drove out into the lane, Niall's Vauxhall swept past her. She caught sight of a smiling Tamsin giving her a friendly wave, and Nikki felt an acute pang of sadness. Her Hannah should be doing that. Going out, having fun, meeting good-looking boys and getting told off by her mother for being late home. But she never would. Not now. As the dark outline of Cloud Cottage Farm rose up ahead of her, Nikki suddenly felt terribly alone. Chapter 23. Just after 6 a.m, as Nikki was sleepily rinsing out her coffee mug, her phone rang. She picked it up, fully expecting it to be the station sergeant, but Joseph's agitated voice jarred her into life. Say that again, and slower. It's Tamsin. She went out for a morning run, and she hasn't come back. Nikki dropped the mug. I'm on my way over. 5 minutes later, she was sliding into a space between Joseph's station wagon and Tamsin's hire car. She jumped out and saw Joseph standing in the doorway. I didn't know she'd gone, he stammered, his face contorted with worry. Sure, she has been going for an early morning run lately, but I didn't dream she'd go today. What the hell was she thinking? Does she always do the same route? Nikki gazed across at the remote marsh path, but saw nothing moving. I think she does a circular run, along the sea bank, then across the field path, down the road past your house, then back down the lane."
Nikki bit on her lip.
"When do you think she went out?"
Joseph shook his head.
"When I showered, I guess, and that was over half an hour ago."
"Surely her run would take longer than 30 minutes, said Nikki hopefully.
20 minutes max, and there's no one in sight in any direction."
His voice was shaky.
"Oh, Nikki, I've got a very bad feeling about this."
"Look, there's a good chance she's fallen, maybe twisted her ankle. The paths are full of ruts from the tractors." She strode back to her car. "You're fitter than me. You take the sea bank. I'll drive along the road to the end of the far field, okay?" As she slammed the car door, Joseph was already sprinting off along the rough track that led along the riverbank to the marsh. An hour later, a squad car was touring slowly along the lanes of Cloud Fen, and several uniformed men and women in Wellington boots were scouring the footpaths that crisscrossed the area of marsh close to Knock Cottage. Joseph and Nikki sat in the kitchen. Nikki heaped sugar into yet another cup of coffee.
"Her jog pants, sweatshirts and trainers have gone, and her day clothes are laid out on her bed, so there is no doubt of her intentions. Her phone has gone, but her house key and car keys are still here. I've rung her number 100 times, but it's switched off."
Joseph got up and began to pace.
"And like most young people, her phone is her life support system. It's never switched off. She's been abducted, Nikki. There's no other explanation."
Nikki passed him the drink and said, "There's probably a dozen other explanations. We're just so aware of what has happened at Flaxton Mere that we can't think of anything else."
"He's got her. I know it."
Nikki looked at Joseph. She couldn't offer any more platitudes because, deep down, she thought he was right. Rory moved uncomfortably in his sleeping bag. Across from him, half illuminated by the bluish glow of his laptop screen, he saw the hunched figure of Stuart Bass. He had been on his computer for most of the night. Rory sincerely hoped that he was emailing his forsaken bride, but frankly he doubted it. Most likely it was morbid research. He turned away from the ghostly figure and decided that tonight they would go home and sleep in proper beds with clean, fresh duvet covers that had been rinsed in meadowsweet fabric conditioner and stored with lavender bags between them. Rory sighed. It really comes to something when your dearest wish in the whole world is not for chilled Bollinger, but for a 2-litre plastic bottle of fabric softener. He pulled the sleeping bag higher around his head. Just one more day down here with the army of forensic help that had accrued around them, and they should be able to have the nights at home. He had barely slept, but even though he closed his eyes tightly, he was still horribly awake. For the first time since he saw the crypt, Rory had felt uneasy. He moved again, unable to find a soft spot on the canvas camp bed. It was probably sleep deprivation, but whatever, he felt disturbed and his thoughts were not comfortable ones. He kept seeing the figure of the bogus Soko, and found it hard to believe that he had actually held a conversation with the curator of this museum of death. Many times he had appeared in court as the expert witness. He had looked across at the accused and wondered about them. The drunk who had lashed out, gone too far, landed one too many punches, or the battered wife who'd been hospitalized once too often and had turned on her husband with a carving knife. Or maybe the battered husband who finally unleashed his hurt and shame and pushed his bully of a wife down the stairs. Murder was not usually served cold and alone, but came accompanied by steaming hot side dishes of rage, passion, or hatred. There were reasons. The deliberate taking of another life was never justified, but there were reasons. I shot him because he broke into my house and threatened my family. We fought because I found him in bed with my wife. The baby wouldn't stop crying. He'd heard them all, but this killer was different. This killer was more like a collector, and the dead bodies his specimens, like beautiful butterflies. Stuart Bass closed his laptop, and the blue light was extinguished.
"Still awake?"
Rory raised himself on one elbow and began to fight with the zip.
"Sadly."
Stuart endeavoured to squeeze his large frame into his own bag.
"Thinking about your silent bedfellows, or maybe the possible return of the murderous axe-wielding Soko. Oh well, sweet dreams."
He pulled on the zip, then groaned.
"Oh, bugger. What now?"
2 uniformed officers were approaching them, and from their purposeful stride, Rory guessed they were not going to offer to tuck him in.
"Professor Wilkinson, I'm sorry, sir, but we've had the order to evacuate."
"What?" He fought to get out of the restricting bag. "Is this some kind of joke?"
"There's been a development, sir. You have to pack up immediately. Some HGVs are on their way to collect all your equipment and the remaining coffins."
"Hell and bloody damnation! We are this far!" He held his thumb and forefinger a half-inch apart. From finishing. What can be more important than 19 bodies, for God's sake?"
The officer shrugged. "Sorry, but DS Easter's daughter is missing, and if the worst-case scenario is right, and the killer has her, there is a high possibility that he will bring her here. That means you could be in danger as well." "In which case, better do as he says, mate." He felt Stuart's hand on his arm. Rory's heart sank. Stuart was right. They had no choice. Dave thought Nikki had aged 10 years overnight. The news of Tamsin's disappearance had rocked the station, and when the DI called a meeting in the murder room, everyone turned up. She began immediately. "You've all heard what happened early this morning. I've just been told that one of the search parties has found signs of a scuffle." She drew in a deep breath, then added, "And a piece of cloth was found in the mud. It had been soaked in chloroform." Dave let out a low whistle. "That stuff is archaic." Nikki nodded. "That's true, and I've spoken to the forensic team about it. It seems it's a very dangerous substance, much misinterpreted in the whodunits." Her face looked haggard. "It does work after several minutes, but it also causes convulsions, and it can be lethal. He reckons that the point where the victim relaxes," she swallowed, "is not far from the moment of death, as it paralyzes the heart muscles." Dave was heartily glad that Joseph was not in the room. For a moment, all he could see was the bright face of Tamsin Easter. He dragged himself back to what the boss was saying with difficulty. "I cannot stress enough how important it is to find Tamsin quickly, because there is another worrying fact about chloroform." She paused. "It can have a delayed effect, and in some cases it can kill. So we need to get out there and find her. Now, this is how I suggest we tackle this." She looked around the room. "I want every member of the splinter group of the History Society brought in. While we question them, I want all their houses and work premises searched, but I have no intention of holding any of these suspects for long." There was a low mutter of dissent, but she pressed on. "Think about it. If they are connected in any way, they could lead us to Tamsin, which is something they can't do if they are incarcerated in our custody suite. We keep them all under constant close surveillance. It's a hope, just a hope, but we have to follow it up. Now, apart from bringing in the suspects, our main search area will have to be the old airfield. This time, however, we will not have our friendly guides with us." She paused. "This is not easy for any of us. Joseph is a valued colleague, and we all feel deeply for him at this time, but I do ask you to stay focused." She looked into Niall Farrow's shocked face. "Don't let your emotions take over. We have to find her, and fast. She is in grave danger. Go to it, and good luck." As the officers dispersed, Dave caught up with the DI. "Gov, where's the Sarge?" "He's with the super, being told to stand back and leave the investigation to us." "And will he, Mom? Would you?" Frank Kohler and his sister Simon Flower and the Brewers were being questioned in different interview rooms. Nikki paced the murder room, cursing loudly to anyone who was within earshot. "Where the hell are the others?" Kat Cullen joined her. "God knows where Marcus Selby is, but Andrew Fryer has been picked up from a liquid lunch in a local bar, pissed out of his brains, or appears to be. The officer who brought him in isn't too sure, so he's getting the FMO to check him out in case he's faking it." "And Joshua Flower?" "His brother says he's gone on a ramble. Apparently it's nothing unusual. Joshua often goes out on the fens, watching waterbirds and the like." "Very bloody convenient." Nikki almost spat the words out. "We've got 2 officers at their house. They'll bring him in as soon as he comes back." "If he bloody well comes back." Nikki's tirade suddenly evaporated. "Kat, come with me. We need to speak to Simon Flower again." In a small windowless room, Simon Flower sat patiently, waiting to be seen. There was no lawyer present, and Simon had been told he was free to go at any point. He was purely assisting them with their inquiries. Nikki slowly and concisely explained that Tamsin Easter had been abducted. "My God, Tamsin!" His eyes widened and darted from one detective to the other. "But that's absolutely terrible. How is DS Easter taking it?" "Much as you'd expect," said Nikki tersely. The man sat shaking his head from side to side in apparent disbelief. Then he looked at Nikki and asked, "Do you think this has anything to do with whatever has happened out at the airfield?" Kat answered, "We cannot rule it out, and because of your associations with Flaxton Mere, we need to know your whereabouts between 5:30 and 6:30 this morning." Simon looked astonished. Then he shrugged. "I was at home alone, probably showering or getting dressed around about then." He paused. "But I did bring work around 6-ish, and they do log calls into the fire station." He frowned.
I was on standby to attend an industrial blaze out at Barley Gate, but I was stood down as another investigator was in the area. That's why I was at home when your officers called to search our house." "And your brother?" asked Nikki. "As I said, out bird-watching. He often goes out before dawn." "It's now 2:00, sir, and he's not returned. Aren't you worried?" "Why? He's probably driven up the coast. My brother comes and goes. He's enjoying his freedom." "And he has no mobile phone?" asked Kat incredulously. "He doesn't own one. He says they are antisocial." Nikki's eyes were hard. "How convenient." Simon Flower sat back and stared at her. "Ah, no. You surely can't think Josh has anything to do with that last disappearing. That's madness." "And what would you think if you were me?" He sighed. "I can see where you're coming from, Galena, but you don't know him. He'd never hurt a fly. He couldn't." "Well, we can't find him, Mr. Flower, and our officers have checked all the places you said he likes to go. So where now?" "I'm sorry, I have no idea." Nikki stood up and pushed her chair back. "Then there's damn all else we can do. You had better get home, sir, and ring us the minute you hear anything, or you clap your eyes on your brother. Understood?" Dave drove Flower home and checked on the surveillance car parked outside. Nothing happening. Quiet as the grave. Dave winced at the choice of words. "We've put another car around the back, so keep your eyes peeled, and we'll have the radio set on talk-through. Let me know if anyone goes in or out, and if Professor Flower turns up, bring him in immediately." Dave had always believed that men should not show emotion, but as he drew into the station car park, he felt a lump in his throat as he thought about what Joseph Easter must be going through. "Mom, we've picked up Marcus Selby." Reg Jenkins entered the murder room. "Been fishing. He arrived back well kitted out with equipment and had a couple of fresh fish in his bag." "And Joshua Flower?" The constable shook his head. "Nothing, Mom. We've notified all the local stations and circulated him as wanted, plus we've put out the details of his car." Nikki turned back to Kat Cullen, who sat staring at her notebook. "Got something?" "Not sure, Mom. I've been going through some reports. Do you remember that the bodies from Flaxton Mere were sort of embalmed and herbs were used?" Nikki nodded. "Well, one of the beat bobbies had a word with the owner of that posh greengrocer on Lower Hill. He sells a lot of fresh, locally grown herbs, and he said that his supplier is one of our historians, Margaret Brewer." Nikki frowned, then said, "A supplier, as in a herb-growing business. Did we know about this? Who interviewed them?" "Me, Mom," Dave answered immediately. "They never mentioned herb-growing. They said they'd retired early and their hobby was the World War II airfield. But another thing about the Brewers, we're having trouble checking their background. In fact, we draw blanks on practically everything they've told us." "Like what?" "Employment, for one thing. The company that William Brewer said he worked for on a freelance basis seems to have disappeared, and we can't find a marriage certificate for them. I've been checking the registers and zero. Kat's taken over that one, Gov," said Dave. "She likes paper chases." "OK, Yvonne, time to practice your knowledge of botany, at the Brewers." Yvonne grimaced. "I barely know my basil from my rosemary." "Good. Go check out their back garden, and without giving anything away, throw in some comment about the husband-wife thing to one of them, preferably her. Nothing heavy, just see how she reacts." Nikki paused. "And take Niall with you, but keep an eye on the lad. I think he's got a soft spot for Tamsin Easter." Yvonne nodded. "Of course, Mum. And it's all right. I'd worked that one out for myself." "And what can I do?" Nikki turned round the moment she heard Joseph's voice. "You're with me, my friend. Either officially or unofficially. I don't care." "Thanks, Nikki. Luckily the super understands. He's told me all the things he's obliged to and asked me to keep a low profile. But I need to get out there." He looked at Nikki imploringly. "We need to find my girl. I can't get her back, then lose her all over again. I just can't." "I know." Nikki felt tears forming and bit them back. "So let me fill you in on the morning's findings." When she had finished, Joseph nodded, then said, "Joshua Flower, has it occurred to you that he might be another victim?" Nikki pulled a face. "I can't say that I'd looked at it that way." "Worth considering." "Maybe." As the afternoon progressed, scores of uniformed officers continued the search for Tamsin Easter and Joshua Flower. They knocked on doors, picked their way through gardens and wasteland, stopped motorists and questioned numbers of vagrants and homeless people. On Flaxton Mere, Sombre-faced men, women and tracker dogs covered acres of marsh and farmland, hunting for anything that might lead them to the whereabouts of the missing girl and the history professor. The airfield teemed with police officers. No one went below ground, and only the people working on emptying the crypt were allowed to leave. Overhead, a helicopter with a heat-seeking camera slowly circled the area. Greenborough Police Station had become a giant magnet, attracting both the media and the general public, all demanding to be told the truth about Flaxton Mere. Finally, the chief superintendent gave a statement. He kept it very much to a plea for help regarding the 2 missing persons, and chose to omit the full details of the horrific find beneath the airfield. "Gov," a young detective with strange staring eyes and an uncanny knack of looking like a teenage drug addict stuck his spiky gelled hair around the murder room door. "Sorry to interrupt, Mum, but we found Flower's car." Nikki, Joseph and Dave looked up sharply. "Where?" "A disused barn between the main road and the airfield. The chopper spotted it through a gaping hole in the roof." "And has anyone seen Flower?" "No, Mum, but we've increased the manpower down there. They've got all the entrances and exits well and truly covered. He hasn't gone on to the airfield." Nikki was not even mildly convinced of that. Joseph Flower knew that place better than any of them. If he wanted in, then she was certain he'd get it. She looked at the odd pale eyes and said, "OK, get forensics. I want that car brought back to the lab and stripped down to bare metal." "Already done, Mum. They're on their way." The young man left, and Nikki turned to Dave. "Are Yvonne and Niall back from the Brewers yet?" "We're here, Mum. Just got in." Yvonne opened her notebook. "Well, they certainly grow herbs, Mum. Big time. They must have 1/2 an acre of them." "And how long have they been doing that?" "Years. It started as a hobby that, well, grew. Thing is, they don't exactly sell them. They just ask for a small donation to buy new seed and compost. It's not a business, it's just what they enjoy doing. Friends can walk in and help themselves, and businesses like the greengrocer pay what they think they're worth." She leafed through her pad. "I got her to give me a list of who she supplies, and I found a familiar name, Mum." She looked at Nikki meaningfully. "Professor Joshua Flower is a very good client." The DI stiffened. "And why is that?" Niall tilted his head on one side and added, "She thinks he has a friend who makes something called potpourri. Reckons she's a local woman who makes dried flower arrangements and herb pillows for charity shops and church fetes." Nikki wasn't convinced. "Check that out, guys. And what about their dodgy marital status? Anything on that?" "As you say, Mum, distinctly dodgy. Even though her old man wasn't there, Margaret Brewer clammed up tight." "Mum, telephone in your office," Kat called out. "Simon Flower for you." "I still haven't heard from Joshua." Simon Flower sounded worried sick. "I phoned everyone I can think of, but no one has seen him. I didn't think too much of it at first, but now, well, I'm really concerned." Nikki wondered how much to tell him, then opted for the truth. "We found his car, Mr. Flower, out near Flaxton Mere." There was a silence, and then she heard a long intake of breath. "Well, I guess it shouldn't surprise us, should it? You know how much he loves it." "Yes, but he knows it's closed off because of our investigation, so why go there? To look for nesting waterfowl?" Her voice held a clear message. I don't know." His voice suddenly lost its strength. "You think he's the one you're looking for, don't you? For whatever you found at the airfield? And for taking Tamsin?" "We need to find him, Mr. Flower, even if it's to eliminate him from our inquiries." "Can I help? I'm going stir-crazy stuck here." "For now, we need you to be there, in case he rings or finds his way home." "I'm sorry, sir. We'll be in touch as soon as we hear anything." Superintendent Greg Whittle gave Nikki a long, hard stare. "This long-term dealer of death was already frightening the shit out of me, and now we have the daughter of one of our officers missing." He leant forward in his chair. "You've talked to this Professor Flower, Nikki. Do you think it's him?" Nikki let out a loud sigh. "Whatever I think, he knows more about that old airfield than any of the others. Plus his car has been found close by, and he's been purchasing massive amounts of herbs for years, and herbs were used extensively in the embalming process." She paused. "And he's missing." "Answer the question, Detective. Do you think it's him?" Nikki bit her lip. Greg Whittle had only been superintendent for a few months, and she was used to Rick Bainbridge's way of working. But Nikki was too close to Joseph, and it was his daughter who was missing. She couldn't trust her own judgment. "I really don't know, sir." "With all that evidence, Nikki, I should have thought you would be champing at the bit to get him into custody. Why the indecision? Was he so charming when you questioned him?" Nikki looked miserable.
No, sir, I wasn't charmed. She thought back to the interview that she and Joseph had conducted in the Flowers study. I admit he's fascinating to listen to, but after a while I found him patronising, and I didn't like his tendency to talk at you rather than to you. Joseph thought it was a university lecturer's habit, but I felt somehow belittled. Academics can do that. Their knowledge can be pretty awe-inspiring, but don't forget, some of the most intelligent people can be totally without common sense, and that, I hope, is where we come into our own. Common sense, solid logic, and basic observational skills will catch more villains than a university degree. He looked at her. So, I ask again. He might be a highly educated professor, but... She paused, trying to recall the conversation. He was so passionate about RAF Flaxton-Mere. Joseph saw how hard he tried to communicate his love of the place. Everyone seemed to look up to him. Without a doubt, he is the leading light in the History Society. If he is the killer, then surely he wouldn't be happy to have all and sundry traipsing around the perimeters of his secret crypt. Greg Woodall peered at her over his glasses. Listen to yourself, Nikki, and try to think a little differently. Instead of passion, what about obsession? Consider him not as a leading light, but as the dominant figure. And if he is the killer, what better way to show his superiority than to allow everyone else, including the impotent police force, to get within a hair's breadth of his underworld? Greg's gaze never left Nikki's face. Think, when we talk about Joshua Flower, are we not describing a psychopath? And does that not strike you as just a little scary? Nikki closed her eyes and whispered, Oh, shit. But if that's the case, where does Tamsin fit into his plan? The daughter of one of those who invaded and destroyed his life's work? Do you have to ask? Chapter 24. Okay, Joseph. We're going to work on the premise that Joshua Flower is our man. I want every detail about the Flower family for 3 generations dredged up and pasted on the wall. Get the brother to help you if you need to. Nikki turned swiftly to Kat and Dave. You guys help Joseph, but first find out how the evacuation of the forensics team is coming along. I'm sure Flower is out there somewhere. He just won't be able to give up. It's his Shangri-La. Her face took on a grim resolve. If he is there, then I'm willing to bet that's where we will find Tamsin. Kat glared at her computer screen. Come on, you lazy sod of a machine! Then she gave a whoop of delight. I knew it! She's not his wife at all! Got something? The young detective constable, called Pete Mitchell, looked at her with raised eyebrows. Something, certainly, but I'm not sure what it means. The Brewers are not married, so why pretend they are? Search me. Pete leafed through a heap of papers. Kat, do us a favour. Help me tie this up. The Sarge wanted it sorted, but now he's asked me to get to work on the Flower family tree. Kat stared at the folder. The dead surveyor from the underground chamber. Yes, I went back to Flaxton-Mere, and the man who recognised him remembered hearing him talk to Carl Shine, and apparently he had a pronounced Irish accent. I've put out a few feelers with the Garda and the Northern Ireland guys. All the details are in the folder. Would you have time to follow them up for me? No sweat, my friend. The Brewers' matrimonial status can wait. I'm on it. An hour later, a smiling Kat sauntered over to her colleague, placed the folder on his desk, and grinned broadly. Mission accomplished, Pete. Meet Michael Finn from County Clare. His gorgeous good looks stirred up a lot of bad memories in the Emerald Isle. It seems your inquiries created something of a stir, as Mr. Finn is well known to the authorities for an assortment of very nasty offences. Kat raised her eyebrows. As in related to terrorism, plus robbery, unlawful violence and possession of firearms, to mention but a few. And, she added with considerable emphasis, it appears he's something of a genius when it comes to building construction and land surveying. He has degrees coming out of every orifice. Now what on earth was he doing wandering around Flaxton-Mere? The young detective leaned back in his chair and raised both hands. I haven't the foggiest, but the boss will be delighted that we have an ID, so would you like to tell her or shall I? In a corner of the murder room, PC Reg Jenkins sat and stared at his notebook. Something wasn't adding up. What's the problem? Dave called across the room. Reg slapped the side of his head and almost shouted, Wrong fish! Pardon? Reg explained. Selby said he was fishing in the private lake down at Fenhouses, but he had 2 roach in his bag. Well, there aren't any roach in that lake. It's stocked with carp. I know. I fished there myself. I caught a smasher a few weeks back. I use luncheon meat for bait, and sometimes... Dave pulled a face. Thanks for the tip, Reg, but what are you actually saying? That I'd like a butcher's in his freezer. Those fish didn't come out of that lake, in which case, where was Selby when Tamsin went missing? Nikki had caught the end of the conversation. Get out there now, Reg, and bring him straight back if you're not happy with what he tells you. Damn and blast it. How can they say we're in danger after my little tete-a-tete security's been so tight you can't cough without filling in a request form signed by the chief constable? They could have let us finish up. Rory watched as a group of policemen lifted the last coffin into the back of the wagon. Don't blame them, mate. 1, there's a young girl missing, and 2, you're far too precious to waste. Stuart patted him affectionately on the shoulder. We could be losing valuable evidence. At least they borrowed a refrigerated lorry for you to keep your bodies in until you need them. Rory grinned for the first time in hours. Oh yes, from the local supermarket. Pray that they emptied it first. Guess what your breakfast sausages have been stored with, Mrs. Grimsdale? That's more like the Rory I know and love. The forensic archaeologist yawned. Shall we go? As soon as the boys in blue have cleared out. I want to do one last check, just to make sure we haven't missed anything. Run that past me again, Joseph. Nikki gulped down a strong black coffee. It's Selby, Mom. We've just heard from Castor Fen. He's done a runner. Where was the car that we had watching for him, for God's sake? There's a side door. It led out to a wooded area between 2 properties. He must have slipped out that way. Put out a call, Joseph. I want him found and deposited in our custody suite until we know what the hell is going on. Kat grabbed the printout from the paper tray and ran to the DI's office. Mom, the Flowers' ancestors. Joshua's father's family were master builders who, according to RAF documents, were involved in the original construction of the proposed superstation beneath RAF Flaxton Mere. Nikki rubbed at her temples and thought swiftly. Really? So when the war was over and the old airfield fell into disuse, Daddy takes Sonny Boy and shows him the secret bunkers, the underground rooms and all that? Looks that way, Mum, but we still keep finding inconsistencies with that damn History Society. I know the professor is our prime suspect, but we thought you should see this. She placed some sheets of paper in front of Nikki. We're not sure if it means anything or not. Nikki scanned the printouts. Ah, Frank Kohler's father was not just a cabinet maker, but did a nice line in coffins too. And as he got out of Germany for political reasons, he might have used his talents to help our own war effort. She puffed out her cheeks. Why did Kohler Jr. not tell us? Probably the same reason that the Brewers lied about being married. Skeletons in the cupboard. Yes, what is all this about the Brewers? I'm absolutely certain it's incest. They're brother and sister. It shouldn't take much to prove it, but unless you say otherwise, I'll put it on the back burner until we have our psycho banged up. What a can of worms we've opened in that innocuous History Society. But yes, that can wait. She read on, then laid the papers on her desk. Anything more of interest from Professor Flower's past? The psychologist has been through everything we managed to pull together on Joshua Flower, and he says the profile is pretty damning. There are several points that stand out. His inability to hold down a job, for one thing. He admitted to Yvonne that he couldn't settle for long. He has no real friends either. Other than casual ones, bird watchers and the anoraks in his club. Joseph entered the room and sat on the edge of her desk. We've just picked up his home computer. IT is checking the hard drive. Good. How is the brother? He rang me this morning. He sounded grim. Pretty shaken. He can't get his head around the fact that his brother may not be all he believed him to be. He offered to help us in any way he can, but I think he's told us everything he knows. Poor bloke. He feels a deep loyalty to his brother, and part of him is certain that we are going after the wrong man, but he can't deny the obvious. Joshua's disappeared, and if he did go off on some innocent walkabout, then his timing leaves much to be desired. Excuse me, Mom. The detective with gelled hair and odd eyes peered around the door. Just heard from the Soko that went out to Flower's car, Mom. He's found a sack in the boot, full of herbs. Nikki nodded, half to herself, half to the others. Then that just about clinches it. Thank you. Tell pathology we'd appreciate a report as soon as they can. Nikki's hand reached out to her ringing phone. Sir? What? Yes, of course, we're on our way. She almost threw the phone down and grabbed her coat from the back of her chair. Joseph, get in the car. We have to get to Flaxton Mere. They found Joshua Flower. Swiftly, she turned to Kat. Stay here. Keep me posted on everything that comes in. We have far too many loose ends, and I need you to be my eyes and ears here in the hub.
Yes, Ma'am, I'll keep you fully updated. Kat looked worried and a little sad that she wasn't in with the action. You take care out there, Gov. Nikki looked over her shoulder and said, Good God, woman, I've got about 50 officers with me. I'm safe as houses. Yet she was touched by the warmth in the younger detective's voice. Light swept the fen. Shadows assumed fantastic shapes, then disappeared, only to be replaced by others. The decaying ruin of the watchtower had taken on the appearance of a haunted abbey, and almost on cue, a mist began to roll in from the marsh. Someone who had no official part in the manhunt sat hunched and low in a small hollow. Protected by a few scrubby bushes and a tangled pile of concrete debris and brambles, the figure was well hidden. Please, the voice was a whisper, let me last long enough to see this through. So much is at stake. Please. The last word drifted off on the night breeze and was lost in the mist. This way, Ma'am. The super is here already. He's waiting for you. A uniformed sergeant met their car. Nikki glanced around and saw that their own men had been joined by an ambulance, the crews of 2 fire appliances, plus an armed unit. Superintendent Greg Woodall and a uniformed chief inspector stood together in the entrance to the control tower like 2 granite statues. Greg placed a hand on her shoulder. One of the search parties found a small storeroom that we'd missed. It seems to have housed dozens of boxes of dried herbs and lavender. When we found it, though, most of them had been emptied. You'll see why in a minute. The chief's words sounded ominous. The second thing the search team found was another small chapel. That's where we're going now. He and Greg entered the building, beckoning for Nikki and Joseph to follow them. The long corridor was filled with officers, yet it was eerily silent. They moved through a low, open door that led to a short tunnel. This opened out into a much older chamber. A cordon ribbon was tied across the opening. The chief inspector stopped. Inside, an arc lamp had been set up, its white light glaring against the pale stone of the walls. Nikki shaded her eyes and squinted. Then she gasped. The chamber appeared to be as old as a burial crypt, although much smaller. Directly in front of her were 2 squat stone columns, supporting a semicircular arch. In the centre was a raised stone platform. Cushioned by a thick bed of herbs and dried wild flowers, lay Joshua Flower. He was fully clothed, lying on his back, and both arms hung over the edge of the stone ledge. The slender fingers of both hands pointed gracefully downward, coated with blood from the deep lacerations in his wrists. Huge pools of it had formed around the base of the slab and spread out across the flagstones. Nikki noted a pocket knife, blade extended, lying just a few centimetres from the right hand. My God, pre-Raphaelite or what? Joseph breathed. Nikki placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder. What now, sir? Greg Woodall leaned against the wall and stared for a moment at his dust-covered shoes. This place is sealed. No one comes in. I want Rory Wilkinson and Richard Foley to see this scene exactly as it is. The search team had the presence of mind to disturb nothing, and I had the paramedic go in purely to officially verify what was patently obvious. Other than that, the place is untouched, and I want it to stay that way until the pathologist and the psychologist have seen it. He paused. We should make an official identification. Joseph looked at the super. Surely we should wait until the body is back at the mortuary, sir. This is all rather gothic. The poor sod could have nightmares for years. No, bring him here. Nikki added, That's a bit tough, isn't it, sir? The superintendent gave a little shrug. I think his imagination would give him more sleepless nights than seeing what really happened. Think about it. They both lived and breathed this place. Sorry, but I think it's fitting that Simon Flower sees how his brother chose to end his life, don't you? Nikki wasn't too sure, but said, Shall I go and break the news and bring him in? Perhaps Joseph would do it, Inspector. I need you to hear what Foley has to say. He waited until Joseph had left, then added, Frankly, I didn't want Joseph hearing the psychologist's profile of the madman who might just have abducted his daughter. Richard Foley, the criminal psychologist, stared thoughtfully into the chamber. Out in the main corridor, beneath lights now powered by one of the generators, both the chief inspector and the superintendent were pacing up and down. Where the hell is bloody Wilkinson? The officer Greg spoke to looked worried. We can't find him, sir. His team and their stuff have all been moved out, but the professor and his associate are nowhere to be seen. He looked suitably abashed, adding, Mobiles don't work down here, and even the radios are iffy in some parts, but his car is still here, so we'll keep looking.
Dead rat, you will. The Chief Inspector snorted impatiently and beckoned Nikki forward down the narrow passage to talk to the profiler. First impressions, Doc. Greg Woodhull had his hands pushed deep into his pockets and his shoulders were hunched forward. Richard Foley stared at the scene before him. I've looked at every aspect of this case, and very little follows the textbook profile of a serial killer, until you look closer. Then there is a pattern, of sorts. He looked away from the body. This is his last act, the finale. He turned to Nikki and the Chief Inspector. It's not unusual for psychopathic killers to kill themselves when they know it's all over. It allows them to keep control over the situation, and not give in. Some like to be caught. They love the publicity and see it as a triumph. Look, I've been killing for years and you never even knew. I'm so much smarter than you. It is all about power. He looked back at the tableau. Yes, I think he would see this as a suitable end to his work. His special place is gone. The people that he killed and cared for have been taken away. There is absolutely nothing left for him. What about Tamsin? Asked Nikki, very glad that Joseph was not here, listening to the psychologist's words. Foley shrugged. If Flower took her, he will have had a reason. It could be perfectly logical to him, but, Galena, this man was insane. Hence we can't follow logical patterns of conjecture. He rubbed at his temple. We mustn't forget that she is a daughter of a policeman, so it might have been a gesture to get back at the police for destroying his lair, or she was his swan song, his final kill. The thought of Tamsin lying dead in this nightmarish underworld turned Nikki's blood to ice. She nodded and went out for some fresh air. Gov, Dave called from where he stood with a group of armed policemen. He spoke quickly to them, then headed in her direction. I just had a call from Cat. They've picked up Selby. The fishing trip was a cover for a meeting with a journalist. He was on his way to Peterborough when we stopped him, to clinch an exclusive with one of the nationals. So we can forget him. He was just trying to cash in on the situation. And regarding Joshua Flower, another nail in his coffin, so to speak, we already knew that his father and grandfather were builders, but apparently years ago, builders often played other roles in village society, and the Flowers doubled up as the local undertaker. Nikki groaned. Oh, sweet Jesus, he learned everything at his father's knee. Dave nodded. So what happens now? We feel like a congregation where the wedding's been called off. No one's quite sure what to do. We're going to have to take this place apart. The clock is ticking against finding Tamsin, but she has to be here somewhere. She felt a pang of fear when she looked around at the size of the airfield. I'm waiting for the go-ahead from top brass. Then we'll continue the search, so hold your positions until further orders. Dave returned to his team, and Nikki was left looking across at what had once been home to heroes, ace flyers and many other brave men. She looked up into the dark grey sky and muttered a rare prayer for the girl's safety. As the car drove across the fen, bringing Simon Flower to be reunited with his brother, neither Nikki nor Joseph realized that a pair of sharp, glittering eyes were following their progress. The concealed hollow was no more visible in the moonlight than it had been before the moon rose. A figure moved, painfully flexing stiff, aching shoulder blades, and looked back towards the control tower. There was a different atmosphere about the place, and the men and women who waited there. On the breeze could be heard voices, the bark of nervous laughter. Something serious had occurred in those grey, disused buildings. It would soon be time to move. Chapter 25. Simon Flower was grey, unshaven, and walked with his shoulders drooping forward and his head bowed. In the long corridor, the superintendent took him to one side. You are here because I thought it best. He looked deep into the other man's eyes. If I'm wrong, tell me. You don't have to go in. To Nikki and Joseph's surprise, Simon said, I need to see for myself, sir. I have a very vivid imagination, and I don't want to spend my life speculating about the manner of his passing. Good man. Greg indicated for Nikki and Joseph to leave, and led Simon into the passageway. It was a few minutes before they appeared again. If Nikki thought he looked pale before, what he looked like now was beyond description. Can we get out of here? His voice was cracked with emotion. Nikki was more than happy to get him back to the surface. The three of them leaned against the wall of the old watch office. I've seen it, but I can't believe what I saw. Joshua couldn't have done such terrible things. Nikki answered,
her voice soft and full of compassion. "We are so sorry, Simon, but there is evidence, and more is coming in every hour. And the worst thing is that Joseph's daughter has still not been found." She touched his arm. "I know this is a lot to ask after what you've just seen, but have you any idea where Joshua might have taken her?" Simon shook his head and said nothing. Joseph added, "Have you got anyone to talk to? Any other family or close friends?" He remained silent. "We do have counsellors, Simon. Victim support has specially trained bereavement officers. It will help to talk, you know." I know. He gave a mirthless laugh. "I'm with the fire service, aren't I? Not only have I offered just that advice to families who've lost loved ones, but I've been there before, when our mother died. It didn't help my brother and me then, and I don't think it'll help now. Thanks all the same." He turned to Nikki and added apologetically, "I'm sorry. I know you mean well, but no one could understand. How could they?" Simon turned to Joseph. "I'm sorry about your daughter, really I am, but I don't know how I can help. I thought I knew everything about this place, but my brother's knowledge—" He shrugged. "It seems I'd barely scratched the surface. I'd help you if I could, really, I would." His gaze wandered towards the door of the building below which his brother lay. "Dear Galena, you said the pathologist would be seeing Joshua soon. When I went down there to identify him, it was such a shock that I couldn't stay, but now, do you think I could spend a few moments with him, before forensics take over?" Nikki looked at Joseph before saying to Simon Flower, "We really shouldn't. It's completely against protocol. Hey, you know about contamination." "Please." There was a world of pain in that single word. Joseph raised an eyebrow and shrugged. Nikki grimaced. "Look, since you're part of the emergency services and you do understand the score, I'll take you back down. But I'll need to stay in the background, okay?" They walked back towards the old weather-beaten door. "Just keep well outside the cordon." Dave walked over to some of his colleagues, realizing too late that Dice, the fireman-cum-amateur detective, was giving them the benefit of his extensive knowledge of serial murder. "Davy boy, my old mate, this is a good one, huh?" Dave smiled weakly and nodded feebly. "Sort of, Dice. Sort of." In order to deflect the man's impending disquisition, he said, "Hey, Dice, how did you get your nickname?" "Me? Yeah, well, it's all about risk, isn't it? Dice with death and all that. Had my share of close shaves, I can tell you. Dangerous game, firefighting." "So, you're a risk-taker, are you?" "Only calculated ones." Dice looked hurt. "I'm a professional, not like Schizo. He was worse. Made Rambo look like Bambi." "Who's Schizo?" "I worked with him years back. I swear he didn't know the meaning of fear. I've seen him do things you would not believe." Dice shook his head. "Some of the guys thought he was some kind of superhero. Others just wouldn't work with him." "And you?" "I thought he was dangerous, and weird with it. Nothing fazed him. Burn cases that would turn the strongest stomach, they were nothing to him. Bodies trapped in burning cars and spitting like a hog roast, no problem." He stopped suddenly and stared at Dave. "But you must know all this." Dave frowned. "I don't know what you mean." "He was here earlier. You know him. He caught a lungful of toxic fumes and got slung off the appliances, stuck out to grass as an investigator. The bloke you were just talking to, Simon Flower. He's Schizo." Dave moved away from the group, thinking about what he had just heard. Simon Flower certainly did not come across as some heroic Red Adair, or even as reckless or irresponsible. Dave bit at his thumbnail. Now why was this information troubling him? Slowly he walked back towards the entrance to the bunker, then stopped. This was hardly the right time to tackle the poor blighter about his career. Maybe it would be better if he offered to chauffeur Flower home again, then perhaps he could throw in a mention about the fire service. On the other hand, to hell with all that, he needed to tell the boss. "Sir?" Nikki stood in the opening into the tunnel and looked hopefully at Greg. "Don't quote the rulebook at me, because I know this is unorthodox, but Simon wondered if he could have a moment with his brother before the pathologist arrives. I'll stay close by."
I don't see why not, since he's used to crime scenes. After all, we're stuck here until bloody Wilkinson gets here."
He frowned and took her to one side.
"But wouldn't he rather wait until later, when his brother's tidied up and ready for the chapel of rest?"
"He seems pretty adamant, sir. I think he's beating himself up about running out just now."
"Oh, well, as long as he knows that he must not cross the cordon."
The superintendent stood back, and Nikki beckoned to the drooping figure of Simon Flower. A moment later, Nikki returned and stationed herself at the end of the tunnel where she could keep a watchful eye on the grieving man. "He knows not to approach the body, sir. He just wants to say goodbye." Greg nodded.
"Fair enough."
He stared at her solemnly.
"We've still no news on Tamsin Easter, and it's critical that we locate her soon. God knows what state she will be in. That stuff he used on her sounds horribly unpredictable."
The superintendent let out a disbelieving sigh.
"It's not something that a modern young abductor would use, but you can imagine that potty old professor and his bottle of poison, can't you?"
Nikki agreed. "It's all very Dr. Jekyll." She glanced down the tunnel, towards the man who stood motionlessly in the opening to the chapel. She noticed that his shoulders shook slightly. She supposed that he was finding his last words to his dead brother very difficult indeed. She began to feel like a voyeur, and she lowered her eyes. "When can we resume the search, sir?"
"A massive sweep is being organized now, Nikki. We have all those guys upstairs, plus a search and rescue team that has just arrived from the Peak District."
Nikki sighed. They couldn't do any more. She just hoped they could be in time.
"Greg, Nikki, a word, please."
The uniformed chief inspector was marching down the corridor with Dave hurrying along in his wake.
"Listen, is Simon Flower still here?"
"Yes, sir." She glanced back down the passageway to the tall, shadowy figure.
"He's with his brother. I was just about to go and get him." "Hold on."
He held up his hand.
"Dave was telling me that Simon Flower has something of a reputation during his firefighting career. Has he ever mentioned anything to you?"
"No, sir. What kind of reputation?"
"Two schools of thought, apparently. Intrepid hero or foolhardy maniac."
"That Simon Flower?" Nikki indicated towards the tunnel. "Are you quite sure, Dave?"
Dave nodded. "His tag was Schizo, and the fire chief has just confirmed it." He added quickly.
"Fire service?"
Nikki clamped her jaw together tightly, as a sickening cramp twisted her gut.
"Flower? Oh, shit! Simon Flower!"
The corridor went silent, and everyone looked at her. Her voice dropped to little more than an urgent murmur.
"The bogus Soko. Rory Wilkinson said his identity card was official, but not one of ours. It could have been a fire service ID card, and the man told Rory his name was Sean Fowler. But you've seen the size of the print on our passes. It could easily have been Simon Flower. And in that poor light, who would have known?"
"Are you absolutely sure, Inspector?" the chief demanded.
Nikki closed her eyes. "Yes. Oh, God. I think we've been blaming the wrong brother. Simon Flower killed his brother Joshua and made it look like suicide."
"Right, let's get him out of the—"
The chief's voice was cut off by a dull thud that echoed and reverberated through the corridor like a minor earthquake, throwing the group of officers to the stone floor. Amid the groans, Dave managed to extricate himself from the tangle of arms and legs.
"Okay, who's hurt?"
Nikki gasped out. "Just winded, I hope. Dave, if you're not injured, take whoever's left standing and go find Simon Flower. Then we evacuate this hellhole." Chapter 26.
"Rory, this is madness!"
Stuart Bass tried to force his considerable bulk through a gap between a stone pillar and a rotting wooden door frame.
"How come no one found this before? Half the force has been tramping around these tunnels for days, and we just stumbled blindly into it. It beggars belief."
"Rory, I mean it. We shouldn't be wandering around here. This place is a bloody labyrinth. No one knows where we are, and you've said it yourself. This part was undiscovered until you fell arse over tip into the opening. The search commander is going to make mincemeat out of us if we don't get back, and for the last time, I can't get through this bloody gap."
"You do whine, Stuart."
Rory shone a torch down the long, wide passage in front of him.
"This is awesome. You could drive a tank down here."
"Probably the original idea, but sadly, as I'm not built like a stick insect, I'll never see it, and I'm deaf—" A dull, bone-jarring thud shook the ground. "Christ, what the hell was that?" No longer wedged, Stuart pushed himself up from the floor and brushed a thick coating of dust from his jacket.
Come on, Rory, I've had it. Enough is enough. Rory? Oh, shit.
The gap through which he had endeavoured to fit himself was no longer visible, and a great pile of loose rubble and timber had taken its place. He began to claw at the blockage, then stopped and smiled with relief. From the other side, he could hear a string of colourful curses.
Glad to hear that you're not buried under this impromptu cairn, Wilkinson.
Likewise, Bass, but I think I'm a fraction too late in heeding your sage advice to get out of here. I needed JCB to get through this lot. Can you get back okay?
Stuart looked around. Yes, the tunnel behind me is undamaged. I'll go for help.
Okay. Meanwhile, I'll check this place out. Maybe I can get out from this side.
For God's sake, don't wander off, you prat. Just stay put. I'll be back before you know it. Are you all right, Nikki? Let me help you up.
Joseph was kneeling by her side. Nikki gasped her thanks and leaned heavily on her rescuer. The pain knifed through her chest as she breathed, but she was pretty sure it was nothing life-threatening.
Jesus, that hurts.
She looked around her and saw Greg, blood dripping down his face, making his way towards her.
Are you okay, Nikki? Joseph? We'll live. You? The same. And everyone else, sir? The chief's taken a bang on the head. He's out like a light. It looks like just cuts and bruises for the rest of us.
He wiped his bloodied forehead with the back of his hand.
Are you sure you're fit to walk back to the surface? One of the men has gone up to get a paramedic for the chief. Maybe they should check you out too.
I'm fine, sir. Just winded and maybe a cracked rib, but what the hell was that?
I dread to think.
Joseph's face was ashen.
But we should get out of here as quickly as possible.
Not until Dave's back. Let's pray he managed to get hold of Flower.
I don't think he was that lucky.
Greg's face was grave as he looked along the dust-filled tunnel to where Dave was limping back, alone. Flaxton Mere seemed to have been thrown into confusion, and the watcher on the fen took advantage of it. Dressed in dark clothing, there was little to differentiate this figure from the others, so it was easy to move unobtrusively through the undergrowth and slip into the now unguarded pillbox. In moments, the shadowy form had disappeared down the stone steps and into the darkness below.
It looks as if 2 of the Marsh tunnels have collapsed, sir, and part of the big storeroom has come down. One wall is completely caved in, and water is slowly making its way through.
A uniformed officer, caked in mud and slime, sat heavily on a low wall.
Is the fire service down there?
Yes, they're trying to staunch the flow by blocking it further back up the tunnel, but it's pretty useless. The force of the water is becoming too much for them.
Okay, well done. Now get yourself back to your original team, Constable. I want all units out from underground and accounted for.
As the officer limped off, Nikki looked anxiously at Greg.
If the tunnels are flooding, what about Tamsin? And Rory and his friend? They've been missing for hours. They might all be in serious trouble.
She coughed and winced.
I know, but the fire service are pumping the water, and we'll get everyone back down there as soon as we've done a head count.
I'm not thinking about the tunnels, but the danger from Simon Flower. If he's holding them prisoner, and they're not already dead, God alone knows what ideas he might have for them.
Dave and Joseph joined them.
Dave found something when he went after Flower,
said Joseph.
When I got into the chamber, it was empty, apart from the body.
But there was only one doorway. What is he, bloody Houdini?
Said Greg.
Sir, everyone was so intent on preserving the scene, they assumed it was a dead end. There's a small opening behind one of those 2 columns, right behind the body. You can't see it from the front of the room. I saw footprints through Joshua Flower's blood, and they disappeared behind the pillar.
Dave rubbed at his leg.
There was some steep steps. I started to go down, but there was no one in sight, so I thought I should get back up. A team of uniforms with an armed unit are down there now. Then let's pray he leads them to Tamsin.
Joseph's voice cracked with emotion, and Nikki grasped his arm.
Hang on in there, Joseph. We'll find her. I know we will.
Stuart Bass reported to the superintendent exactly what had happened, and a group of men were sent to try to clear the blockage and rescue the pathologist. As Stuart had feared, Rory, who was not renowned for his patience, had not waited to be rescued.
This is not going to be easy, Mr. Bass. One of the men stood with his hands on his hips. "If we attempt to move that stone pillar, we could have the whole roof down, along with half the marsh." He drew in a lingering breath. "And as the obstruction is on the other side, it looks like we need specialist equipment to shore this up before we chip our way through." He shrugged. "I hate to say this, considering the circumstances, but I'm going to have to ask the fire department for help." "Attention, please. This area is being evacuated. Would all personnel and their vehicles move away from the buildings? Repeat, move away from the buildings. The RV point is now the hangar area near the main gate." Nikki, Joseph, and the superintendent looked at each other. "What's this all about? We still have Tamsin and our idiot of a pathologist along with a serial killer down in the bowels of the earth. Why the hell are we pulling out?" Nikki felt her stomach churn with fear. A uniformed inspector hurried towards them. "We are evacuating for a very good reason, Superintendent Woodall. The fire crews have found timers, charges, and detonators. The collapse of the tunnels was not a natural disaster. Someone has invited half the North Sea into Flaxton Mere." Nikki swallowed hard. In her mind, she saw Yvonne Collins' report of her conversation with Joshua Flower when they first checked out the pillboxes. Simon Flower, ex-Royal Engineers. Her mouth went dry. She looked at Joseph and saw his jaw had dropped in horror. He was whispering his daughter's name over and over. Greg Woodall clapped his hand on Joseph's shoulder. "Hold on, man. We don't even know for sure that your girl is down there, and if she is, we'll do our damnedest to get her out. You know that." "If he can't have his sanctuary, then he's going to make damn sure no one does." Joseph bit back an oath, then turned and walked away, leaving Nikki with the two other officers deciding on an emergency evacuation plan. Joseph was on a knife edge. It was like being back in the battlefield, but with Tamsin caught in the crossfire. He sat on a half-demolished wall and tried to collect his thoughts. "Sarge." Dave Harris, Niall Farrow, and a big athletic man that he had never seen before were hurrying towards him. "Sarge, this is Stuart Bass, forensics, mate of our missing pathologist. Listen, sir." Dave looked distraught. "We've just heard the evacuation order, and we know exactly what's at stake. But we are not going if there's a chance Tamsin and the prof are down there somewhere. We wanted you to know that we are going back underground to look for them." Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, then stared at the men. "Apart from getting yourselves killed, you'll get the book thrown at you for this, you know that." "Absolutely, sir." Niall's jaw was set. "And I also know I couldn't live with myself if that maniac gets to Tamsin without me doing something about it." "Okay, count me in. If we ever get out alive, we'll think of some excuse. Let's go." As the four men ran backwards towards the control tower, Stuart said, "Damn you, Rory Wilkinson. I should be on a sun-drenched beach with the most beautiful woman in the world right now, not trying to save your spotty ass from some psycho." Chapter 27. Someone had caught him off balance, and he was easily overpowered. This didn't surprise him. The nearest Rory ever came to physical exertion was a little light-hearted wrestling before a more intimate form of exercise. Opposite him, lying on a heap of blankets, was the unmoving form of a young woman. She had regained partial consciousness a couple of times, but she had been too sick and confused to tell him anything. He guessed she was Sergeant Easter's daughter, and he was desperately worried about her condition. The sickly sweet odour in the small room must be chloroform, Rory thought. He knew all about that insidious substance. She needed medical help, but Rory was certain she wasn't going to get it from the motionless figure with the strange bright eyes that sat a little apart from them. Rory had known from the moment that he entered the room that for both their sakes he had to find a way of staying alive long enough to allow the police to find them. He tried to remember everything he'd heard or read about serial killers, but understandably his thought processes were not functioning too well. At least he seemed to have a little time, as neither of them had been immediately dispatched. The silent man was obviously waiting for something. They were in a small room, lit by a battery-powered lantern. Both men sat on wooden chairs. The only difference was that Rory's feet were secured to the chair legs, and his hands were bound tightly together with duct tape. Rory shivered. He'd heard that killers were often egotists, believing themselves superior and above or apart from the law. Maybe he should try flattery. Rory also knew that the last thing he should do was beg for mercy, and at that moment, blubbering was the only thing he felt capable of. Simon Flower broke the silence. "They're leaving now."
Ah, we'll have the place to ourselves. Alone at last, as they say.
Flower looked at the pathologist with interest. You can joke. Aren't you frightened? Rory swallowed and pulled tentatively at his restraints.
Shit scared, old son. Absolutely terror-stricken.
You certainly don't seem it.
Well, rumour has it that you are a crazed psycho, teetering on the brink of total madness, but if you'll forgive my saying so, you don't seem like that either.
Flower frowned. I'm not sure how to take that. Rory did not answer. At that moment, he was dearly wishing that he'd chosen psychology for a career. He held on to the thought that the police would not abandon them. He just had to try to stay alive long enough to give the boys in blue something to rescue.
Call me psychic, but I knew we'd meet again. We have met before, haven't we?
Oh, yes. And I had every intention of making that happen, Professor Wilkinson. After all, I couldn't leave without thanking you personally.
Ah, for desecrating your beautiful mausoleum, no doubt.
Flower looked around the tiny, shadowy cavern. It wasn't a mausoleum, Professor. It was a sanctuary. He spoke softly.
Why did you kill those people?
Rory immediately regretted his words. What the hell was he trying to do? Hasten their execution? Flower shook his head. If you recall our conversation the other day, you told me my sanctuary was a peaceful place, a place of beauty. So in my eyes, you never actually desecrated anything. You chose to work and sleep there, which was extraordinary. You respected it. When I said I wanted to thank you, I actually meant it. He smiled coldly at Rory. And why did I kill those people? He shrugged. Why does anyone do anything? Because they want to? Because they like it? Because they can? He paused. In my case, I enjoyed taking their dirty, stinking bodies and making them whole again. I mended them, took away their addictions and their filthy habits. I nurtured and looked after them in a most professional manner, and finally gave them peace. The handsome face suddenly became hard. You saw my work. Was I ever a butcher? And where exactly is the difference between you and me?
I've never seen better, said Rory truthfully. Your methods of preserving the bodies were a perfect synergy of modern science and historically documented embalming techniques. Amazing. Simply amazing.
Flower nodded. And your thoughts on the difference between us?
You took their lives before you gave them the benefit of your expertise. I only offer them my care and considerable virtuosity when they are already dead.
Very good. But you have to admit there's a fine line. Most normal people could never find it in them to do your job. Rory thought the fine line was actually a chasm, but decided he was probably wise not to argue the point.
True, true.
He glanced at Tamsin. She was still breathing. Flower moved closer, and Rory could feel the man's breath in his face. What sort of lives did they have anyway? You must have noticed the kind of victims I chose. Vagrants, methies, junkies, runaways. The eyes were glittering dangerously.
I see. You chose the ones that wouldn't be missed.
Of course, but that's not the whole reason. It goes deeper than that. I took those filthy bodies and made them clean. I made them pure. I turned their stinking, tainted selves into something wholesome again. Flower leapt from the chair, knocking it over and scaring Rory.
But who cares anymore? It's over now, stolen from me by one man's greed, that miserable, avaricious glutton called Shine.
Rory saw the man's hands begin to grip and release as he paced the room.
He's dead now, Simon.
Which is a great pity, because no matter how he died, I could have made it 1,000 times worse for him. Rory watched the man's composure begin to show signs of unraveling, and he tried to redirect the conversation.
Can I ask you something? As a professional, I have to say that the equipment you use is excellent.
Rory deliberately faltered.
Oh, I guess it doesn't matter what I say now.
He sighed a little theatrically.
You see, the police couldn't trace where it had come from. They still have no idea.
Flower continued to pace around. Oh, that. It's American, shipped over via the continent. The quality was better than ours.
How on earth did you get it here?
Flower stopped pacing and said, "It was ostensibly for a university project for Joshua's college. I paid for it online. It was easy to fake the documents and forge a signature. I collected it from the docks myself, hired an HGV, and under cover of night, drove it directly into one of the derelict buildings and put it together at my leisure." Rory nodded sagely. He wondered if the man talked at such length to all his victims. He chanced another swift look at Tamsin and wondered if he dare mention her precarious condition. Flower went to the door and listened for a while before picking up the fallen chair, sitting back down and tapping his foot on the stone floor. Rory decided it was definitely not a good moment to refer to Tamsin's plight. He searched around in his addled and exhausted brain for some other topic of conversation to spin out the time.
"I know I'm being a pain with all these questions, but if you don't mind me asking—"
The man gave him a suspicious scowl. "You're becoming a nuisance." Rory smiled and nodded.
"That's me. Right vexation to the spirit. But something is really bothering me."
He looked inquiringly at Flower. "What now?"
"It's about the most recent ones, the last two, visitors to your sanctuary. When I examined them, I realized they were quite different to your other—"
He fought to find an alternative word for victim.
"Your other works of art."
Flower seemed to relax. "Ah, you could tell, could you? That surprises me. But yes, neither of them were part of my plan. They just needed to be dealt with because of their actions." He threw Rory a conspiratorial smile. "Mind you, I must say it made a very pleasant change to deal with such wholesome bodies."
"The dark one was certainly something of an Adonis."
Rory tried to sound casual as he fought back a wave of nausea. "And the other one was spotless. Apart from that stupid childish tattoo, there was not a blemish on him. He even smelt good." Flower sighed. "Something of a waste, really. He blundered into one of the old buildings just as I was opening one of my secret entrances, so—" He shrugged. "I didn't have much choice."
"And the other one? The one with the black hair?"
Flower's frown creased into furrows. "His death is that bastard Carl Shine's fault. He was checking the ground with some very sophisticated high-tech equipment, dangerously close to my sanctuary and to my devices."
"Devices?"
"My carefully planned son et lumière. Sound and light to keep the curious away and the superstitious cowering in their beds." He gave a little laugh. "Funny how modern techniques used in the army for distraction purposes can be adapted to feed people's irrational fears of the unknown." He shook his head. "All wasted now."
"You must have spent a lot of time here,"
Rory said with what he hoped sounded like empathy. "Every hour God gave me, whenever I could, day or night. This is my spiritual home." He suddenly let out a low growling noise, stood up, and began pacing again. Rory's shoulders drooped. He knew he'd pushed his luck about as far as it would go. Flower continued to pace, then looked at his watch and flopped back down into his chair, chewing on the inside of his cheek. After a few minutes, Rory chanced, saying,
"We seem to be waiting for something."
"Yes, we are."
"And?"
Flower dropped his head into his hands. "I'm so very tired. There's such a lot to do." When he looked up, Rory saw hollow eyes and a pallor of skin more appropriate to his own dissecting table. "I have opened the exits at the furthest points on the marsh. They are flooding as we speak." He gave Rory another creepy, conspiratorial smile, "but not as badly as our friends in the police and fire service think. When I was here last, I prepared a few diversions. I left them a few little indications, detonators and the like. I've also just brought down a storeroom wall, purely for effect." He pointed to a small device, something like a TV remote, clipped to the waistband of his trousers. "My time in the Royal Engineers was not for nothing." He rubbed his eyes. "Actually, I have about 2 hours until the high tide comes in, and then, with the aid of this little beauty, no one will ever try to put a housing estate on Flaxton Mere again." Flower stood up and walked towards the door. "Not long now, and we'll be able to go, but we need to tread very carefully because of my rather clever diversions."
"Go where?"
Rory felt a frisson of fear, then a glimmer of hope. He had used the word we. "Back to my sanctuary. Where else?" The glimmer of hope died. Rory knew that he would never be able to keep up the banter, even though their lives depended on it. He sagged forward
and although a terrible ennui was creeping insidiously through his mind, he desperately tried to keep going. "And what about that lovely young woman over there?" Flower's head tilted, with a quick, twitchy motion. "Yes. Now, there we have a problem. Some people don't react too well to my preferred form of sedative, and she was one of them. So, what to do?" The question hung in the air. "I could take a look at her, if you like. I admit that my patients are usually beyond help, but I am still medically trained." "Nice one, my friend, but I don't think so." Rory's head felt as if it would explode. How long could he keep this up? Opposite him, pacing slowly backwards and forwards, Flower seemed to be in some sort of trance. He was muttering the name Joshua as he walked. "At least your end came in the place you loved," he concluded. Rory felt as if iced water had been thrown at him. "Joshua is dead too?" "Oh, he's dead. Very dead, but—" Flower straightened up with a jerk. "You don't think that I—" He let out a staccato, barking laugh. "He died by his own hand." Flower sank onto the chair, slowly shaking his head. "Joshua knew I had to be involved. He believed I'd done something terrible." Rory's head ached, and it was becoming difficult to concentrate. He knew that he was being used as a sort of confessor, and Flower seemed to want to take his time with his story. "In the end, I told Joshua everything. Everything I'd done over the last 20 years, and how and why. And I told him of my plans to give Flaxton Mere back to the sea, but he never answered me." The voice broke. "He never said a word. He just hugged me and cried like a baby." Flower drew in a deep, noisy breath. "He told me he loved me. Then he ran from the house, jumped into his car, and I never saw him again until an hour or so ago when the police brought me here. He's in the small crypt." He stopped, mid-sentence, then stood abruptly and said, "It's time to go. I have to attend to 1 or 2 small jobs." "And the girl? What about Tamsin?" asked Rory desperately. Flower slowly turned. His expression was steely cold. "I've lost everything. This place was my life, so I'm going to share a little of that hurt with the detective sergeant. Let's see how he feels about losing something rare, precious, and beautiful." Chapter 28. Dave frowned. "This place is a bleeding rabbit warren. They could be anywhere. And didn't someone say half the North Sea might soon be making its way down the tunnels?" Stuart Bass was unconvinced. "I think that's a diversionary tactic to get us out. He's buying time." He bit his lip. "While Rory and I were working in the burial chamber, we talked about how tormented the killer must be to be separated from his holy of holies. Rory always said that he'd be unable to stay away." "I thought the same thing," said Dave. "And now there's nothing left. He's even taken care of his brother. What's the betting he goes back to his sanctuary to kill himself?" "And my Tamsin. And Rory?" Joseph asked slowly. Stuart shrugged. "Where else would he take them?" "Then I think we'd better get our asses down there." Niall was hair-sprung taut. Stuart started to agree. Then they heard the sound of a policeman's boots running up along the corridor behind them. The uniformed inspector raised his eyebrows when he saw them. "Your superintendent said you should all be severely reprimanded and read the Riot Act for this, but unofficially, you might welcome a bit of support. Is that right?" He smiled. Dave grinned. "You were so right, sir. Now, what do you think about this?" He told the inspector of their assumption. The man looked grim. "Okay, it's worth a shot. I'll radio the RV point and tell them to give us another unit as backup. Now, show us where the hell in this labyrinth we're supposed to be going." It took about 10 minutes to get back to the surface and reach the pillbox. Then Joseph and the 3 others, backed by the small armed unit, slipped silently down the stone steps and into the burial chamber. The inspector spread his arms, and the policeman moved in pincer formation around the big crypt. Joseph looked across at him and raised his hands, palms up, as if to say, "What now?" "He'll be here." The inspector raised his finger to his lips. The support team concealed themselves, and the chamber appeared to be empty. Out on the fen, a team of armed police officers formed a cordon around the pillbox. Underground, hidden and silent, the inspector's team waited. One of the generators was running, and a few safety lights had been left on. Above the soft humming, Stuart could hear his own heart beating. It felt as though the whole chamber were reverberating with its steady thump. Then there was another sound. Footsteps, and a shuffling, dragging noise. It was coming from a narrow corridor behind the stone altar which had supported the mortuary table. When Stuart saw the figure of his friend hobbling into the chamber, it was all he could do not to cry out. Then he saw that Simon Flower was immediately behind Rory, tightly gripping his arm and holding him close. Stuart gritted his teeth. There was no clear shot for the marksman. He watched the two men stand perfectly still and gaze wordlessly around the chamber. From his hiding place in the shadows, he wondered if Flower would feel as he had, that the magic had gone. Stuart heard a low, almost inhuman, keening sound that seemed wrenched from the depths of the man's dark soul. Flower flung his prisoner to the ground and ran howling down the steps towards the crypt and the empty shelves where his victims had been stored. He stood in the archway leading to the burial chamber and gazed at the desecration. He slowly turned back to his prisoner. The pathologist was clasped tightly in the arms of his friend. Stuart shuddered as the killer took a step towards them. Then, to his relief, the man halted as the barrels of 6 automatic rifles pointed at him. "Simon Flower, keep your hands where we can see them, then get down on the floor. Now!" Flower froze. His hands were held out and his eyes were wide with anger and confusion. "Get on the floor!" 2 of the armed officers were slowly approaching him. Rory whispered, "He has a radio device on him. He's going to bring this whole place down." Before Stuart could open his mouth to warn the marksman, Flower began to bend forward, as if complying with the order. Then Stuart saw his hand slowly reaching toward his waistband. As he yelled out, he realized that his was not the only voice screaming. Still on his feet, but motionless as a statue, Flower remained crouched over. Then his hands reached desperately behind his back, trying to grasp at something. Stuart's brain refused to compute. There had been no shots fired. Then he saw Simon pitch forward, the thick black handle of a knife protruding from an ever-widening dark stain on his back. He crashed onto the ancient flagstones, revealing a white-faced, black-clad figure that had emerged from the shadows behind him. She looked down at the motionless body and said, "Franson!" Chapter 29.
"Rory, where is Tamsin? Is she here?"
Joseph threw himself down next to the pathologist.
Yes,
Rory stuttered, the shock beginning to take hold.
"She's back down a long corridor through there."
He pointed to the back of the altar.
"She's in some kind of big storeroom. We'll have to hurry. She's very poorly."
Leaning heavily on Stuart Bass, he staggered to his feet.
"Joseph, we have to go very, very carefully. I think Flower might have booby-trapped the room."
Joseph exhaled, then drew in a long, deep breath. He'd been in this sort of situation more times than he liked to count, but now his daughter was the one under threat.
"Are you strong enough to guide me?"
he asked Rory.
"As long as Bass here continues to be support staff."
He looked anxiously towards Stuart.
"Let's go." "I'm coming too."
Niall Farrow moved quickly forward, but Joseph grasped his arm and held him back.
"Not this time, Niall. You're keen, dedicated, and full of all the right things, but once Rory shows me where Tamsin is, I have to go in alone. This is no place for policemen or pathologists. It's a job for a skilled soldier."
Niall was about to protest, but saw Joseph's face and backed off.
"Just get her out of there, Sarge."
Joseph squeezed the young man's shoulder.
"I will. You can rely on that."
He turned to Rory and Stuart.
"Ready?"
"Ready."
As Joseph moved down the tunnel, memories of his years in the army flooded back. Then the thought of his daughter. The sounds of war, the gunfire and the roar of engines, faded, and his daughter's voice filled his ears. There's plenty of time. Joseph increased his pace. Yes, there damn well would be plenty of time. Finally he heard Rory say,
"Slow up. This is where I believe he started to place some sort of traps. Tamsin is in that room to the right, about 20 yards further on."
"Okay. Now you and Stuart get back. There's no telling what might happen. Get yourselves to safety, and tell PC Farrow to make sure that absolutely no one comes down this passage, understand? No one."
As the 2 men made their way back, Joseph surveyed the passage ahead of him. He could not move forward until the way was clear. He squatted down on his haunches. It seemed an eternity before he spotted the first wire. Indirectly, it was Simon Flower that made the discovery possible. He had left battery-powered lanterns at points along the underground tunnel, and although the light was patchy, Joseph's sharp, well-trained eye caught a tiny glint of metal wire. He waited until the sounds of the retreating men had faded, and then he sat a little longer, calming his racing mind. Then he began a careful evaluation of the situation. "I naturally assume that your request for privacy did not refer to me." Joseph swallowed hard. He hadn't heard Nikki until she was close to his shoulder. "It damn well did. Now get back up that tunnel and stay there." "Bollocks! Now what exactly are we dealing with?" Nikki's voice gave him enormous encouragement and left him weak with fear at the same time. "You're not going to go, are you?" Nikki sounded almost scornful. "You need to ask." Joseph exhaled. "Okay, this is what we have. There are tripwires at intervals between us and the room where Tamsin is. I suggest they are little more than fireworks, something that would give a warning blast to scare us, but not bring down the roof." He bit hard on his lip. "I'm pretty sure he wanted me to find my daughter before he killed me. As I see it, I've got two choices. I either cut the wires and risk setting it off, or I deliberately trigger it. It will take far too long to disarm the damn things." He turned and looked at Nikki. "Back off a bit, and protect yourself as best you can. I'm going to check them out." After a few minutes, he returned to where Nikki was crouching low on the floor. "It's safe. He must have set them up in a hurry. They were simple tripwires to small detonators, so I've disconnected them. Now, just walk behind me and keep to the center." He pointed down the passage to the aperture leading into the room. "Rory says that Tamsin is on the floor against the far wall. I'm assuming there will be other devices between us and her." He stopped abruptly. "Now, Nikki, forget that it's my daughter in there. We can't let emotion get in the way. This is a puzzle to be solved, nothing more." He looked at her anxiously. "Can you do that?" "I used to do it every time I visited Hannah. I'm a pro. Just tell me what you want me to do." "Right. Follow me, then wait in the doorway, just in case anyone else thinks my order did not apply to them. I'll check out the entrance, and if I feel it's safe, you follow my instructions to the letter." For once in her life, Nikki did not argue. She walked softly behind him, then placed herself in the middle of the doorway and stood still. Joseph knew what to look for. At least he's used old methods. If he'd had more time, I'm willing to bet he would have used laser beams. He moved slowly into the room, murmuring as he went, "Possible pressure pad beneath this uneven stony area." He stepped carefully around the broken flooring. "Shit, this feels so familiar. Only back then I had a bomb disposal squad behind me and a unit of armed operatives." "You've got all you need, Joseph," said Nikki softly. "Your expertise, your instincts, your gut reaction." She paused. "And someone who believes in you." "Dad?" Joseph froze. Tamsin was turning towards him, her eyes unfocused and her body uncoordinated and floppy. "Stay still, sweetheart. I'm coming to get you. Just stay perfectly still." The girl mumbled something, then reached out towards him and tried to get up. "I feel sick." "Don't worry about it, Tam. You're going to be fine." Nikki's voice was calm and commanding. "Now listen to me. You must keep perfectly still and do everything your father tells you. Understand?" Tamsin sighed and lay back down. "I can't afford for her to try to get to me." For the first time, Joseph sounded agitated. "Breathe and calm down, Joseph. She's fine. Just do what you were doing. I'll worry about Tamsin for you." It seemed to Joseph that it took hours to reach her. In fact, it was only 4 long minutes. In those minutes, Nikki had constantly calmed and cajoled, and he had crept and sweated his way across the room. And now he had to make the journey back through the shadows, and he had to do it carrying his half-delirious daughter, all 5 feet 8 inches of her. "Joseph, hold it. Don't start back yet," Nikki called out. He saw her turn and move out of his line of vision. Dave's voice spoke urgently in the darkness, then she returned to her position in the doorway. "Okay. Whenever you're ready, my friend. It's time to go home." "That's Dave out there. What does he want?" "Time for that later. Just get your girl out of this bloody Hades. The chopper is up there on standby with the paramedics and emergency doctor. She'll be in hospital in no time. If you just get your sodding finger out, Sergeant." That flash of the old Nikki made everything clear. He knew the way forward now. Joseph took a deep breath, whispered "I love you" to his daughter, and purposefully retraced his footsteps through the minefield. He didn't know that water was beginning to flood the tunnels. As Joseph made his way to safety, Rory sat wrapped in a thermal blanket in the superintendent's office in Greenborough Police Station and tried to recall everything that the murderer had told him. Shock was making him shiver, but he doggedly answered the questions.
And he denied killing his brother?
The superintendent looked incredulous.
Emphatically. In fact, I would swear that he didn't. I think Joshua tried to take the blame, to protect Simon, and give him a chance to get away.
Even after Simon had admitted what he had done?
Definitely. There is some deep history there, and I'm sure you guys will dig it up. I suggest Joshua knew perfectly well what had sent Simon off on a killing spree lasting 2 decades, said Rory. You've told me how Joshua was found, and I think he staged the whole theatrical shebang to confuse you.
He drew the blanket closer around him,
even down to the poorly hidden car and the herbs in the boot. Everything.
Greg Woodall leaned back in his chair.
Maybe you're right.
Rory accepted a mug of tea from Yvonne Collins and held it in both hands, savouring the warmth.
What will happen to that poor woman, Stephanie Taylor?
She'll be sent for psychiatric assessment, but there's not a jury in this land that would put her in jail for what she did, or I sincerely hope not, said Greg vehemently.
How did she know where he'd be? How did she get inside?
Easy, answered Yvonne. She's been hanging around the Fens since before we found her brother. Reg kept taking her home, but in the end he gave up and let her wander. He felt sorry for her, so he talked to her quite a lot, perhaps a bit too much. Anyway, she got it into her head that the killer would come back to his killing grounds, and she was right.
Greg nodded. And you know the chaos when Flower first brought down those tunnels. She was dressed in dark clothing, so she mingled with all the other helpers and walked straight in.
Revenge served cold,
murmured Rory. Chapter 30.
For the umpteenth time, Tam, he'll be along when he's finished his shift.
Joseph shook his head and looked with great affection at his daughter.
And I have a few things to sort out this evening, so you will have Niall Farrow all to yourself.
Tamsin shifted around in the hospital bed and tried to get comfortable. You did bring in my makeup bag, Dad, and my hair straighteners.
Joseph nodded. And the other 20+ things that you just can't live without.
God, I look a mess.
You look beautiful. You always look beautiful.
Tamsin pulled a face. Bullshit! I'm a mess and you know it. Joseph smiled down at her. Tamsin had been incredibly lucky. She had been carefully monitored for 3 days, and now the doctors were pretty sure that there would be no delayed effects from the chloroform. In a couple of days' time, if she continued to improve, she could go home. And right now, home meant not cottage. Tam was quite happy with that. She had Skyped her mother and reassured her that Joseph hadn't tried to either kidnap or murder her. In fact, he had saved her life, and she had decided to stay on for a while. She had told Laura that she wanted to be fully recovered before she flew. But Joseph knew there was more to it than that. Even through her hazy, drug-induced stupor, she had known it was her dad who had walked the line to carry her to safety. There had been a major shift in Tamsin's attitude towards him, and now they had something to build on. There was a kind of irony about what had happened. After all, the one thing Tamsin hated most about him had been the very thing that saved her. His skill as a soldier had allowed him to carry his daughter through a minefield and survive. He gave a little smile of amazement as he placed her things in her locker. For the first time in years, Joseph Easter actually felt good about himself. Nikki sat in front of Greg Woodall's desk and leafed through a pile of reports.
These pretty well explain most of it. She rubbed her tired eyes. It's hard to believe that Joseph would protect his murdering psycho brother.
Greg leaned forward, elbows on his desk and his chin resting in his hands. Nikki grimaced.
I think Joshua felt he'd failed his little brother years ago.
She sat back, closed the folders and sighed.
When I rang you to tell you about the family being undertakers, I also had Kat tracking down old medical reports on the mother's death. I'd already ascertained that the father died of a heart attack, but the mother died of uterine cancer when Simon was 13. He took it very badly indeed. He worshipped her. But thousands of kids lose their adored parents, and, okay, they may suffer terribly, but they don't become killers. Possibly they didn't witness their mother being beaten and raped by some rootless tramp she had tried to help.
Oh, shit.
Greg's head fell forward. The cancer set in shortly after. Simon swore the tramp had killed her. Nikki shook her head. The psychologist believes that young Simon could not come to terms with the atrocious assault on his mother, so he started killing vagrants and doing his best to make them into something clean and respectable, thereby giving his mother back her dignity. Later, it became an obsession. He liked killing and dealing with the bodies.
Surely he must have had something in his make-up to make him take that path.
Doc Foley said the same, sir. His mother's death was the trigger. He always had the propensity to kill.
Hence, I suppose, his ability to deal so casually with all the horrific things he saw in the army and as a firefighter.
Greg whispered almost to himself.
Schizo.
Nikki opened up another report. It says here that even as a youngster, Simon helped his father look after the bodies. Showed quite an aptitude, apparently. His father had high hopes that he would take over the business. He was very intelligent, but even at school he had what one teacher described as a morbid and almost obsessive interest in death.
Shame no one ever looked closer at that boy. Could have saved a lot of lives.
Greg drew in a long breath and leaned back in his chair.
By the way, before I forget, I've had a memo from the Met. They found a close link between our dead Irishman Michael Finn and one of their nastiest villains, a man named Freddie Carver. Now Carver has recently done a very hasty bunk from our shores, and apart from waving flags in the streets by way of celebration, they have uncovered intelligence that said he was preparing for a very big job in the city. Now he has pulled the plug and legged it.
Nikki frowned. And what does that mean exactly?
The Met reckon Michael Finn was the kingpin for the proposed heist. Without him, Carver was scuppered.
Greg gave a smug smile.
Back in the day, Carver used to be a bosom buddy of another family of villains called Shire. Ring any bells?
We wondered if Carl Shine's real name was Daniel Shire.
Nikki exhaled.
Of course, those shady surveyors were Freddie Carver's men. Carl went to an old family friend for help and managed to get his right-hand man topped.
No wonder Shine's murder looked like a professional hit, because that's exactly what it was. Family friend or not, Carl Shine managed to shut down one of the Smoke's biggest criminals, and he paid with his life.
So that's something else we can cross off our to-do list, and with all I've got on my plate, I'm eternally grateful.
Oh, Lord, Nikki. It's your father's funeral the day after tomorrow, isn't it?
Nikki placed the folders on his desk. Yes, sir. I'm taking the next couple of days off. She shrugged. Then I guess it'll be back to business as usual.
I suppose you haven't considered something as ridiculous as a holiday, have you? It's what most normal people would do after the kind of ordeal you've just undergone.
Nikki stood up and made for the door. She turned and threw her boss a withering look. Sorry to disappoint you, sir, but I don't do holidays, and there is one particular criminal I still haven't laid my hands on. Chapter 31. At least it was a sunny afternoon, and the grounds at the crematorium looked green and lush, with well-kept beds of yellow daffodils lining the drive. Joseph had been surprised to see how many work colleagues had turned up to support Nikki. As the final music played, and they all filed out of the chapel, he saw Nikki standing alone by the door. She looked as smartly dressed as he'd ever seen her, and her bearing said she was totally in control. Although her lips smiled as she began to shake hands with the stream of mourners, he felt a wave of intense loneliness emanate from her. Without a word, he eased past the vicar and stood beside her. Her tired smile said it all.
Almost over, he whispered, touching her arm lightly. And you were brilliant.
I didn't feel it. She looked at him, with relief in her eyes. But at least I didn't crumple in front of everyone. It took some while for the chapel to empty, and then they made their way out to the area set aside for the flowers. Even though Frank had requested donations to charity, Nikki had decided that she couldn't cope with seeing a plain coffin, and had ordered a single tribute, a beautiful spray of pure white lilies and ice-white roses that cascaded along the full length of the coffin. As soon as they were outside, Joseph left Nikki greeting distant friends and relatives and accepting condolences from strangers, and went to talk to Greg Woodall.
"No Tamsin with you?" asked the superintendent. "She begged me to let her come, sir, but I had to pull rank. She really isn't strong enough yet to cope with something like this.
That damn stuff really messed up her system. Thank the Lord you reached her when you did, Joseph. Greg looked back towards the tall chimney of the crematorium and shivered. The alternative doesn't bear thinking about.
Joseph nodded grimly.
Luckily, she doesn't remember too much of her ordeal, but in a fuzzy kind of way she does recall that it was Nikki who stopped her from crawling across that booby-trapped room, and for that she's one grateful young woman, I can tell you. I'm sure she is.
Greg looked around at the familiar faces.
Good to see such an excellent turnout from our guys. As funerals go, it really was a lovely service, although I don't know how Nikki managed to read that poem.
Joseph nodded. He still got goosebumps when he thought about it. He told her not to put herself through it, to let someone else read, but Nikki had insisted. As soon as she began, he had known it had been the right thing to do. He understood that it was something she had needed to do for her father. Joseph looked around the crowded area and tried to spot the man Nikki had pointed out before the service as being Frank's old friend, Tug Owen. Then he noticed a lone figure walking away from the others in the direction of the car park.
Excuse me, sir. There's someone over there that I really need to have a word with.
Joseph left the superintendent and hurried after Tug.
Mr. Blake Owen.
Ah, it seems that my carefully planned escape has been foiled.
The older man turned around and gave Joseph a weary smile.
DS Joseph Easter, I presume?
He held out a hand, and his grip was surprisingly strong.
Call me Tug. I just wanted you to know that I haven't told Nikki anything about what we talked about. I think it should come directly from you.
He looked at the old airman and decided to trust him.
Nikki needs to know absolutely everything. Her father died before he could tell her something that was very important to him, and now that thing is vitally important to Nikki. She deserves the truth, Tug, whatever that might be.
Joseph looked at the doctor earnestly.
Look, the last place Eve was seen was at Flaxton Mere, and 19 bodies were found interred there. I thought that she could have been one of the victims, but our pathologist has confirmed that no one brought out from that underground crypt resembled Eve, and that leads me to believe that she's still alive.
She is? It was a woman's voice. In his haste to talk to him before he drove off, Joseph hadn't noticed that Tug's car was not empty. As he turned, the door opened, and a tall, upright woman stepped out. The black-clad figure stared at him, and Joseph stifled a gasp. She was much older, but there was no mistaking the woman in the photograph.
Joseph, I'd like you to meet Eve Anderson.
Tug's voice held the slightest tremor.
Eve, this is Joseph Easter, a close friend of Frank's girl, Nikki.
Joseph numbly took her outstretched hand, and in an instant understood why Frank had been so desperate for Nikki to find her.
It's a pleasure to finally meet you,
he stammered. He was looking into Nikki's eyes and seeing the same quizzical upturn of Nikki's lips. But these eyes were not smiling. They were the eyes of someone bereaved, someone who has lost her soulmate.
Were you in the chapel for the service?
Joseph managed to ask.
No, I stayed outside. I had no right to be here.
The voice was deep and well-spoken.
I think, said Joseph slowly, that you had every right to be here. More than most, added Tug Owen. Then he turned to Joseph. And I agree that Nikki needs to be told, although not by me. It should come from Eve. But not today, the woman said firmly. Nikki has enough to deal with, and I have no wish to intrude or cause her any further distress.
She smiled at Joseph.
Let Nikki say goodbye to her father. Let her grieve. Then, she paused, if she'll agree to see me, I promise that I'll explain everything.
Joseph took a deep breath and held it. He looked into those eyes that were so familiar, and knew instantly that Frank Reed had never had a first wife, and there had never been a tragic accident. He asked,
Do you really mean everything?
Everything, she replied, giving him a direct and knowing stare. She opened the car door and began to get back in. Joseph stepped forward and held on to it, preventing her from closing it.
I'm sorry, Miss Anderson, but the problem is, you really don't know Nikki Galena. She's not your average woman, and she doesn't do unsolved cases of any kind. And more than that,
If she finds out that I've been standing here talking to her mother and then let you drive away again, she'll personally see me hung, drawn, and quartered. Come back with us now. Please?
I can't. This is not the right time.
I think it's the perfect time.
Joseph tilted his head to one side.
Look, I'm under no illusion that this will be easy for either of you, but I'll guarantee there's no one Nikki would rather meet, today or any other day.
His smile broadened. The woman shook her head. All right, although this is not what I had planned.
Joseph said, We need to go now before you change your mind. After everything that's happened recently, I really don't think I'm up to facing the wrath of Nikki Galena.
The Last Flight. Poem written by Nikki Galena, for her father, Wing Commander Frank Reed, AFC, RAF, DFC. The angels have wept that one of their own should be kept from the skies for so long. Now their gain is our loss that you're finally free, so go back to the place you belong. The heavens are yours to play with again, to fly and to dive and to soar. And now you have wings of your own to use, and no need for an engine's roar. Sadness, you said, was returning to earth, while your soul still glided above. Now freedom is yours to fly for all time, and know that you do it with love. For although my heart is now cleft in two, because your face I no longer can see, the thought of you soaring through cerulean blue brings solace and comfort to me. Now starlight and sunlight and crystal clear air will not allow me to mourn, as you speed your way to eternity, through diamond night to golden dawn. This concludes Killer on the Fens by Joy Ellis. Narrated by Henrietta Meir. Copyright 2016 by Joy Ellis. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Joffy Books and was produced in the year 2017 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks and to take advantage of special offers.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.